Hi everybody. Tonight let me tell you the beginning of a long, winding story. A story that reaches back over 2,000 years into the heart of an empire where the sun blazed upon marble columns and the cries of men echoed in the sand-filled arenas of Rome. It is a story not of emperors or senators, nor of kings or generals, but of a man born of no power and yet remembered by the ages. A man named Spartacus. You may have heard his name before. Whispered through history as the leader of a slave rebellion that shook the mighty Roman Republic to its core. But who was Spartacus? Why did he rise? And why did he, of all men, dare to challenge the might of Rome? Let me take you back to the quiet hills of Thrace, a land of misty forests and whispering winds, where Spartacus is believed to have been born. The air in Thrace carried a scent of pine and wild herbs, and the men there were known for their fierce hearts and bold spirits. Life in Thrace was not easy. Tribes clashed, the earth was rugged, and survival depended on strength and cunning. Young boys were taught the art of war almost before they could walk, learning to wield spear and sword under the watchful eyes of their fathers. And so Spartacus grew in a world where freedom was all a man had. Yet even this fragile freedom was torn from him. The details of how he was taken remain a shadow, lost in the folds of time, but it is believed that Spartacus once served as a soldier, perhaps even for Rome itself, before falling into captivity. Some say he deserted the legions, others whisper that he was betrayed by his own. Whatever the truth, one quiet morning he was no longer a free man but a captive, sold like a beast in a market square. The clang of chains upon his wrists would mark the first notes of a song that would echo across an empire. Imagine, if you will, the open markets of Capua, where the wealthy Romans shopped for human lives with the same casual air they bought olives or fine silks. Spartacus, tall and broad-shouldered, caught the eye of a lanista, a master of gladiators. Lentulus Batiatus was his name, a man of influence and cold ambition. Batiatus saw in Spartacus not a slave, but a future champion of the arena, a fighter who could bring him fame and fortune. And so Spartacus was led to the gladiator school in Capua, a grim fortress where men trained by day and fought by night. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, iron and blood. Every day the whip cracked in the training yard, forcing broken men to rise and fight again. Here, Spartacus met others like him, men of all lands, all languages, bound together by chains and the cruel hope of survival. They spoke in hushed voices of their homes, of wives left behind, of children never to be seen again. These were not born warriors. They were farmers, shepherds, soldiers, and fathers. At night, Spartacus lay on the hard stone floor, staring at the shadows cast by flickering oil lamps. He remembered the forests of Thrace, the laughter of his kin, the soft whisper of the wind through pine. Freedom, once a simple, silent gift, became a ghost that haunted his every waking moment. And as the days stretched into weeks, a slow fire grew within him, not of blind rage but of a deep, quiet resolve. He would not die chained like an animal. But escape was no simple dream. The gladiator school was a prison within a city, guarded by men who knew the cruelty of desperation. Yet Spartacus watched and waited. He learned the rhythms of the guards, the patterns of their patrols, the moments of carelessness. And all the while he spoke in low tones to those he trusted. Crixus, a towering Gaul with eyes of fire, Oenomas, a fierce Nubian warrior with scars that spoke of countless battles. Slowly, a brotherhood was born, a fragile alliance bound by the silent yearning for freedom. The spark that lit the fire came unexpectedly. One evening, a rumor swept through the barracks. A new shipment of gladiators would arrive, and the guards would be fewer in number, distracted by drunken revelry. It was a chance, a slim, trembling thread of hope. The plan formed like the slow unfurling of a leaf. Simple, desperate, deadly. They would rise, seize what weapons they could, and fight their way out. Death awaited them either way, but Spartacus whispered into the shadows, better to die free than live chained. And so, beneath a sky heavy with stars, the night came. The men lay silent in the dark, hearts pounding like war drums. Every footstep of the guards sent a shiver through their bones. When the signal came, a soft, deliberate knock, the barracks erupted in silent motion. They surged forward with kitchen knives, spits, anything that could cut or stab. The element of surprise was their only weapon. The guards fell in moments, their cries muffled by the press of desperate hands. Spartacus led the charge through the gates, eyes blazing not with hatred, but with the sheer, burning will to live. They seized weapons from the armory, gladius swords, shields, the tools of their captivity turned now into instruments of their freedom. By dawn, the gladiator school of Capua stood silent, its gates thrown open, its walls stained with the memory of rebellion. Spartacus and his brothers vanished into the hills, leaving behind a world they would never return to. Yet this was no mere escape. It was the beginning of something Rome had never seen. A storm of men, bound by nothing but the shared thirst for freedom, rising against the greatest empire the world had known. And Spartacus, once a slave, stood at its heart. In the hush of dawn, the hills above Capua stirred with the rustling of wind through the olive groves, carrying with it the faint scent of blood and the sharp tang of iron. Spartacus and the small band of gladiators, fewer than 100 souls, pressed onward into the wild lands beyond the city's reach. The roads, once filled with the steady march of Roman legions and the slow tread of merchants' carts, now seemed strangely silent. Every step they took away from the walls of Capua felt like a heartbeat stolen from fate itself. They moved with the stealth of hunted men, slipping through narrow trails, crossing shallow streams, and hiding beneath the thick canopy of ancient oaks. The forests here whispered secrets of old wars and forgotten kings. Yet among the shadows of those woods, a new story was beginning. A story of men who had tasted the bitter chains of captivity and spat them into the wind. At first, there was little order among them. They were gladiators, not soldiers of a standing army. Each man carried his own wounds, his own anger, his own desperate dreams. Some argued for splitting up, for fleeing in different directions, hoping to vanish into the countryside and live as free men. Others, driven by the fire of fresh bloodshed, hungered for battle and revenge against their Roman oppressors. The group teetered on the edge of dissolving, bound by little more than the memory of a shared escape. But amidst the murmur of doubts and the clash of tempers, Spartacus stood silent, watching. His eyes did not burn with fury, nor did his voice rise to command. Instead, he spoke softly, with a quiet strength that reached beyond words. Around a small fire in the deep hours of the night, he spoke of freedom, not as a fleeting chance, but as a cause worth fighting for together. He painted for them a vision not of vengeance, but of a life reclaimed, a life where no man bowed beneath the yoke of another, where families could walk the earth unchained, where the laughter of children rang free under open skies. The words sank into the hearts of those men like slow, steady rain upon dry earth. They did not shout or cheer, but as the fire flickered low, a silent understanding grew among them. They would not run. They would stand, and they would fight, not for blood, but for the right to live as men. In the days that followed, they moved deeper into the hills of Mount Vesuvius. The slopes, steep and jagged, offered a natural fortress. Here, amid rocky cliffs and dense thickets, Spartacus began to mould the ragged band into something more than a group of fugitives. He taught them to move as one, to watch each other's backs, to strike together with the precision of soldiers. They learned to set ambushes along narrow passes, to read the signs of approaching enemies, to disappear into the shadows before a foe could react. But it was not Spartacus alone who forged this brotherhood. By his side stood Crixus, the towering Gaul whose laughter could shake the leaves from the trees, and whose axe fell like thunder upon his foes. There was Onomos, silent and steadfast, whose hands bore the scars of 100 whiplashes, yet whose eyes held a calm deeper than any storm. Together they became not just leaders, but brothers of the spirit, different in blood, united in purpose. Their first true test came sooner than they expected. News of the gladiators' escape swept through the Roman towns like wildfire. The Senate, ever wary of unrest, dispatched a small force to hunt them down, a cohort of hastily gathered militia, local soldiers too proud to fear a band of runaway slaves. They marched toward Mount Vesuvius with the confident swagger of men certain of an easy victory. Spartacus watched them approach from the high ridges, their gleaming shields catching the morning sun. He saw the looseness of their formations, the careless way they moved through the narrow passes, and knew that Rome had made its first mistake. They underestimated men with nothing left to lose. When the Roman cohort entered the defile beneath the cliffs, Spartacus and his men sprang the trap. Stones rained down from above, crashing into shields and scattering the enemy ranks. From the woods, the gladiators charged, silent shadows turning into a wave of fury. The Romans, caught between panic and pride, faltered, and in that moment Spartacus struck. He moved like a wind-driven flame, fast, relentless, silent. His sword, once a symbol of his bondage in the arena, danced with deadly grace. Around him, the fight surged, a brief, brutal clash that ended almost before it began. The Romans fled, leaving behind their dead and their pride. But Spartacus did not chase them. He gathered his men and spoke quietly once more. Victory was not their goal, it was survival and freedom. They took what they needed, armor, weapons, supplies, and vanished into the forests before Roman reinforcements could arrive. The victory sent ripples across the countryside. Word of the gladiators' triumph spread from village to village, carried by whispers in the night. And as it did, something unexpected began to happen. Slaves, men and women bound to Roman households, chained in the fields, beaten in the mines, began to run. They fled their masters, slipping away under cover of darkness, drawn by the faint hope of freedom and the name that was beginning to stir hearts across the land: Spartacus. Day by day, the band upon Mount Vesuvius grew. No longer just gladiators, they became a swelling tide of the oppressed, a river of men and women who had known only chains and now saw for the first time a path to something more. Spartacus welcomed them all, not as soldiers but as brothers and sisters in the cause of freedom. And so, beneath the looming shadow of the volcano, a new force began to rise, not born of conquest but of hope. The Roman world, vast and proud, stood unaware that in the heart of its land a quiet storm was gathering, a storm that would soon sweep across its cities, its legions, its very heart. The rebellion had begun. The summer sun crept higher over the ridges of Mount Vesuvius, casting long shadows across the steep slopes where Spartacus and his growing company made their camp. The air was sharp with the mingled scents of pine sap, damp earth, and the faint trace of volcanic ash. From high upon the rocky ledges, the world below stretched vast and open, a patchwork of Roman farmlands, villa estates, and winding roads that led like arteries toward the heart of the Republic. Here, amid the rugged crags and thickets, Spartacus walked quietly among the men and women who had gathered under his cause. They numbered in the hundreds now, former slaves, farmers, shepherds, even a handful of Roman deserters. Some bore the hardened muscles of field labourers, their hands still calloused by years of toil in the vineyards and grain fields. Others carried the haunted eyes of men who had survived the mines or the cruel training pits of gladiator schools. They had come with little more than the clothes on their backs and the silent hope of deliverance. At first, the camp was little more than a scattering of rough shelters, branches tied with strips of bark, woven reeds for bedding, fires burning low beneath carefully banked stones. Food was scarce, and the mountains gave little in the way of easy harvest. Yet in that wild encampment something deeper stirred, a sense of unity that transcended the simple need for survival. Spartacus did not set himself above them. He slept upon the bare ground like the rest, his sword always at his side, not as a symbol of command but as a silent companion in the long watches of the night. He ate sparingly, worked alongside the others to build shelters, and shared in the burdens of the day. When disputes arose, he listened with patience, weighing each word with care before giving counsel. His voice, calm and even, became the thread that wove the camp together. It was not the voice of a conqueror or a warlord, but of a man who spoke of freedom as though it were a living, breathing thing. Fragile, precious, worth every drop of sweat and every beat of the heart. In the evenings, as the fires flickered low and the stars unfurled across the velvet sky, Spartacus would sit among them and speak softly of the world beyond Rome's reach. He spoke of Thrace, of its green forests, of the songs sung around ancient hearths, of the simple joys of a life lived without fear. His words painted visions of a land where no master's whip cracked in the morning air, where no man's worth was measured by the coin he fetched at a market. The people listened, their faces lined with the weariness of past suffering, yet lit by a growing ember of hope. For many, it was the first time they dared to imagine a life not shadowed by chains. And in those quiet moments, beneath the vast and silent stars, a bond grew, not of fear or obligation, but of shared dreams. Yet the weight of reality pressed ever closer. Roman patrols scoured the countryside, their numbers increasing with every report of the rebel camp. The Senate, at first dismissive of what they called a band of runaway slaves, began to recognize the rising threat. A new force was dispatched, an entire praetor's detachment, seasoned soldiers with orders to encircle Mount Vesuvius and crush the rebellion before it could spread. The soldiers came with methodical precision, setting camps along the base of the mountain, cutting off the paths to the towns and roads. They dug in, building fortifications and watchtowers, their confidence bolstered by their superior numbers and training. They believed they had penned Spartacus and his followers in, a wild animal trapped in a hunter's snare. But Spartacus watched from the heights, his gaze steady, his mind turning over possibilities like stones in his hand. He knew the mountain better now, the hidden paths, the narrow gullies, the ancient trails left by shepherds long forgotten. And in those paths he saw the slender thread of a chance. Gathering his closest companions, Crixus, Immerse, and a few trusted others, Spartacus laid out his plan. They would not charge blindly against the Romans, walls, nor wait to be starved into surrender. Instead, they would become as the mountain itself, silent, unseen, and unyielding. By night, they gathered vines and strong branches, twisting them into rough ropes and makeshift ladders. They fashioned simple hooks from iron, scavenged from the Roman dead and the remnants of broken tools. While the soldiers at the mountain's base grew complacent, believing the rebels trapped, Spartacus prepared for a different kind of escape, one the Romans would not see until it was far too late. On a moonless night, under a sky thick with drifting clouds, Spartacus and his men descended the sheer cliffs on the far side of the mountain. One by one, they slipped down the rocky face, gripping the rope vines with calloused hands, moving in silence, broken only by the whisper of wind and the soft tap of stones tumbling into the darkness below. It was a perilous descent. Sharp rocks, loose footing, death waiting in a single misstep. Yet not a man faltered. By dawn, they emerged at the mountain's foot, unseen and untouched. The Roman soldiers, confident in their encirclement, never imagined the rebels would escape where no path was thought to exist. And Spartacus, with a force grown bold by necessity and hardened by the fires of shared resolve, did not merely slip away. He struck. The Romans awoke to the clash of steel and the roar of voices rising from behind their lines. Spartacus led the charge, his sword flashing in the first light of morning. The rebel force descended upon the unprepared Roman camp, like a storm unleashed from the mountain itself. Tents fell beneath the weight of the assault, soldiers scattered in confusion, and before the sun had risen fully, the Roman blockade was broken. Spartacus stood amidst the smoking ruins of the Roman camp, his heart steady, his gaze fixed beyond the battlefield. The path before them lay open, not just for escape, but for something greater. No longer were they a band of fugitives fleeing the shadow of Rome. They were an army rising from the forgotten depths of the oppressed. The rebellion was no longer a whispered rumor among slaves. It had become a roaring fire, a fire that would sweep across the Roman countryside, igniting hearts with the hope of freedom and kindling fear in the hearts of Rome's proudest men. And so, with the sun lifting over the horizon and the ashes of a Roman defeat still warm at their feet, Spartacus and his followers vanished once more into the land. Not as hunted men, but as the living embodiment of a dream Rome had long forgotten. The dream that no empire, no matter how mighty, could chain the will of free men forever. The summer days rolled on, golden and heavy with the scent of ripening wheat fields. In the heartlands of southern Italy, a strange and growing unease settled over the Roman countryside. Villages that once bustled with the hum of labour and the proud steps of Roman overseers now grew quiet beneath the whisper of rumours. Across the lowlands and rolling hills, the name of Spartacus passed from mouth to mouth, not as a fugitive to be hunted, but as a beacon of hope for those who had long lived under the heel of Roman chains. Spartacus and his followers moved like a shadow through the land, swift and elusive. Their ranks swelled each passing day. Field slaves fled the estates of wealthy patricians, leaving behind ploughs and sickles to join the cause. Shepherds abandoned their flocks, miners laid down their picks, and even some of Rome's own soldiers, embittered by harsh command or a lifetime of scorn, deserted their standards to follow the rebel leader, whose name was now spoken with reverent fear. Their army was a strange tapestry, a mingling of peoples from every corner of the empire. Gauls with fair hair and fierce tempers, Thracians with sharp eyes and silent steps, Greeks with cunning minds and swift hands, Africans hardened by the burning sun, and countless Italians, long bound by Rome's ruthless hand. They spoke in many tongues, bore the scars of many battles, and yet, under the steady gaze of Spartacus, they stood as one. He trained them not as a Roman general might. He did not enforce rigid discipline with lash and sword. Instead, he taught them with patience, shaping them into a force that fought not for conquest, but for the preservation of their fragile hope. Crixus led the vanguard, his voice booming across the training fields as he hammered lessons of war into the hearts of the newest recruits. Onomas, ever silent, moved among them with the quiet grace of a hunter, showing them how to read the land, how to vanish before a stronger foe, how to strike with precision. In the heart of every camp they raised, Spartacus made time to speak, not in the tones of a commander barking orders, but as a man among men. He reminded them always that they fought for their lives, for the chance to live free under open skies. He urged them to hold no hatred in their hearts, for hatred, he warned, was a chain of its own kind, one that bound a man's soul as tightly as any Roman shackle. Yet even as their numbers grew, so too did the shadow of Rome's wrath. The Senate, humiliated by the defeat at Vesuvius, could no longer dismiss the uprising as a mere band of escaped slaves. They dispatched Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor of proud lineage with a force of 3,000 men, seasoned soldiers drawn from the heart of the Republic. His orders were clear: crush the rebellion swiftly and show no mercy. Glaber marched south with confidence, certain that a disorganized mob of slaves would fall before Roman steel. He found Spartacus encamped near the town of Nola, his followers gathering supplies and resting after weeks of ceaseless movement. Believing the rebels vulnerable, Glaber moved quickly to encircle the camp, cutting off access to roads and water, trapping Spartacus against a rocky hillside with no clear path of escape. The Roman soldiers, grim and disciplined, set their lines with practiced ease. They built fortifications, raised palisades, and settled into the quiet certainty of victory. For them, it was not a question of if, but when. But Spartacus, ever watchful, saw not a prison in the encirclement, but an opportunity. In the dark of night, as Roman sentries warmed themselves by flickering fires, Spartacus gathered a band of his most trusted men. They slipped away into the hills, silent as mist, carrying with them not swords or shields, but the tools of farmers, scythes, axes, and heavy ropes. They moved swiftly through the winding paths, using the dark folds of the land as their cloak. By the time the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the Roman sentries were startled by an eerie sight: a flood of wagons, laden with burning pitch and tied with ropes, careening down the hillside toward the heart of their encampment. Behind them came Spartacus and his men, charging with wild cries, the rising sun at their backs and the fury of desperate freedom in their hearts. The Roman camp erupted into chaos. Fires spread among the tents. Soldiers scrambled to form ranks, only to find their lines broken by the crashing wagons and the sudden, relentless assault of Spartacus' forces. In moments, the carefully laid Roman siege dissolved into a whirlwind of battle cries, smoke, and the desperate clash of steel. Spartacus fought at the forefront, his sword flashing in the smoky dawn. His movements were not those of a man driven by rage, but of one possessed by unwavering purpose. Around him, his followers pressed the advantage, their belief in their leader lending strength to arms that had once known only toil and servitude. Glaber's force broke beneath the assault. The praetor himself fled the field, his soldiers scattering in every direction, their once proud standards abandoned in the mud and ash. Victory was swift, but Spartacus allowed no time for revelry. With the Romans routed, he ordered his men to gather supplies and disappear once more into the countryside before larger legions could be summoned. His message was clear: they would not fight Rome's battles on Rome's terms. The news of Glaber's defeat shook the Senate to its core. This was no mere rebellion, it was a war against the very foundations of Roman order, led by a man who seemed to move with the cunning of a general and the heart of a free king. Across Italy, the legend of Spartacus grew. Farmers whispered his name in the fields. Slaves sang songs of his victories as they toiled under watchful masters, and even the free citizens of Rome began to murmur uneasily about the storm rising beyond their city walls. But Spartacus remained unmoved by fame or fear. He looked upon his growing army and knew that every victory, every escape brought them not just survival, but something more profound, a living proof that even the mightiest empire could be shaken by the will of the free. And so, beneath the golden sun of a land awakening to the call of freedom, Spartacus marched on, not toward conquest, but toward a future yet unwritten, where every step carried the weight of countless lives hoping at last to be free. The autumn winds swept gently over the hills and plains of southern Italy, rustling the fields of harvested grain and carrying with them the murmurs of a land unsettled. Along the winding roads, traders whispered of the slave army that had humbled Rome's soldiers. In quiet taverns and bustling market squares, the name Spartacus travelled further than any legion's banner, spoken with a strange mix of awe, hope, and fear. Yet, high in the wooded hills beyond the reach of Roman patrols, Spartacus moved not as a conqueror, but as a man carrying the fragile burden of many lives. His army, now numbering in the thousands, was no longer a mere band of fugitives. They were a swelling tide, drawn together by the thin silken thread of freedom's promise. But with numbers came hardship. Feeding an army of slaves, former labourers and their families was no small feat. They moved often, never lingering too long in one place. The lands they passed through gave what little they could, fruit from the wild trees, fish from the streams, and grain taken from the estates of Roman nobles who had fled in fear of the uprising. Despite the scarcity, Spartacus forbade wanton pillaging. "We are not Rome," he told his followers one cool evening, as the embers of their fires flickered beneath a silver moon. "We will not become the tyrants we flee." His words, spoken softly, carried further than the roar of battle. They instilled a quiet discipline, a sense of shared honour that bound the army together not by force, but by a vision larger than any single man. Yet not all saw the world through the same eyes. Among the leaders who had risen beside Spartacus, none was more formidable or more restless than Crixus. The Gaul, fierce and headstrong, burned with a desire for open war. He believed the time had come to march north and challenge Rome itself, strike at the heart of the Republic before it could muster its full strength. Around the fires, murmurs grew louder. Crixus's followers, a strong force of Gauls and Germans, clamoured for battle, for plunder, for the spoils of a Rome they had long feared. They saw themselves not as fugitives but as avengers of their own suffering. Spartacus listened in silence. He understood Crixus's heart, the raw ache of years spent beneath the lash, the hunger for a reckoning. But Spartacus also saw further. He saw the legions Rome could summon from every corner of its vast territories. He knew that to strike at Rome's gates too soon would be to invite annihilation. One cool morning, beneath the fading light of dawn, Spartacus and Crixus stood apart from the camp, gazing over a quiet valley bathed in mist. The wind whispered between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I do not wish to fight you, brother," Spartacus said at last, his voice low and even. "But if you go to Rome now, you go to your death, and to the death of those who follow you." Crixus met his gaze, eyes burning with the stubborn fire that had made him a leader among men. "I would rather die striking at my enemy than wither in hiding. I cannot wait for Rome to chain me again." Spartacus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then go, take those who would follow, but know this, I will not march upon Rome, not yet. We have much to build before we can truly be free." With a solemn nod, the two men parted, not as enemies, but as brothers walking different paths. Crixus led a force of thousands northward, their banners fluttering beneath the autumn sky. Spartacus watched them go, a shadow of sorrow passing across his heart. Days turned to weeks. Spartacus moved his army southward along the spine of the Apennines, avoiding direct confrontation while gathering strength. His followers grew in number, runaway slaves, deserters, even some freedmen who believed in his cause. Wherever they marched, they left behind not destruction, but a lingering hope. But the Senate was not blind to the spreading embers of rebellion. Learning of Crixus's movement, they dispatched 2 consular armies, one to pursue Spartacus, another to cut down the force under Crixus. The consuls, proud and battle-hardened, believed they would quash the slave rebellion as easily as stamping out a smouldering fire. Crixus met them on the plains near Mount Garganus. The battle was brutal. The Roman legions, disciplined and ruthless, crashed upon the Gauls' forces with unrelenting precision. Crixus fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, his axe rising and falling amid the clash of shields and the roar of dying men. But numbers and training turned the tide. When the dust settled, the field was strewn with the bodies of the fallen. Crixus himself lay among them, his heart pierced, his sword clenched in a hand that refused to let go even in death. Word reached Spartacus days later. He stood silent for a long time, staring into the flames of a campfire that cracked softly against the chill of evening. Around him his men waited in hushed reverence. At last he spoke, not with anger but with a quiet, steady sorrow. Crixus fought for freedom and died a free man. His voice carried through the night, settling upon the hearts of those who listened like a soft mantle of resolve. In honor of his fallen brother, Spartacus held games, a solemn tribute to the man who had fought beside him from the beginning. But these were no blood sports for the pleasure of a crowd. The games were a rite of remembrance, a way for his followers to pay homage to a warrior's courage and to remind themselves of the price they all risked in seeking freedom. As autumn deepened and the first chill of winter touched the land, Spartacus prepared for the road ahead. Rome had shown its teeth and would soon bare its fangs in full. But Spartacus, though heavy with loss, stood undaunted, for in his heart he carried not just the dream of a single man, nor even of a single army. He carried the dream of every soul who had ever bent beneath a master's yoke. And that dream, forged in the fires of battle and tempered by the sorrow of loss, would burn brighter than ever in the long shadows of the coming war. The first whispers of winter's breath coiled along the hillsides as Spartacus led his people further southward, threading through the rugged contours of Lucania and the heartlands that clung to the coasts of southern Italy. The air was sharper now, scented with the dampness of distant rains and the smoke of hearth fires burning in villages that dotted the countryside like fragile islands in a sea of unrest. The march was relentless, yet measured, a steady flow of movement that wove through forest and field alike, always a few steps ahead of Rome's tightening noose. The army, though worn and marked by the trials of endless flight and battle, moved not with the desperation of fugitives, but with the quiet determination of those who understood that each day of freedom was a victory in itself. Along the winding roads, more souls joined their ranks, fugitives drawn by the flicker of hope that Spartacus had become. They came singly and in small groups, men with shackles still clinging to raw wrists, women carrying the gaunt faces of children wrapped in scraps of cloth, and even elders who had lived long years beneath the weight of a master's hand. They brought little but their hopes, and Spartacus took them all. Yet this growing multitude posed challenges far beyond the clash of swords. Supplies ran thin, and winter's creeping chill threatened to turn the army's slow march into a struggle for mere survival. The fertile lands of the south, long harvested and stripped by Roman estates, offered little to those seeking to live by the fruit of the earth alone. Spartacus, mindful of the fine line between freedom and lawlessness, issued a quiet decree. The army would take only what was needed, no more. They would raid the estates of the rich, strip storehouses of grain and seize livestock, but never would they burn villages, nor harm the poor, nor steal beyond necessity. His men, though battle-hardened and often ragged with hunger, obeyed, not out of fear, but because they had come to see in Spartacus a leader whose word bore the weight of something sacred. Even in their hardships, moments of quiet grace appeared, flickers of humanity amid the darkness of war. Around evening fires, men and women gathered to share not just food, but stories. Tales of homelands far away, of loved ones lost and still longed for. Old songs, sung in many tongues, drifted into the cold night air. And Spartacus, often seated among them, listened, not as a distant commander, but as a man among his people, bound by the same fragile thread of hope. But Rome was not idle. The Senate, stung by the defeat of their praetors and the embarrassment of Glaber's rout, turned to two new commanders, Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, both consuls of the Republic. Unlike the hastily dispatched forces of before, these men commanded full legions, drawn from the hardened veterans of Rome's frontier walls. Their orders were absolute: find Spartacus, encircle his forces, and crush the rebellion before spring could bring renewed strength to the slave army. Word of the advancing legions reached Spartacus, while his followers camped near the ancient town of Thurii, its stone streets lined with the quiet dignity of a forgotten Greek past. The tidings came on the breathless lips of scouts, men who had slipped through Roman lines under the veil of night. The news weighed heavily upon the hearts of the rebel leaders. Some counseled immediate retreat into the mountains, others argued for a desperate stand upon the open fields. Yet Spartacus, calm amid the rising storm of voices, stood silent until the last had spoken. When he spoke, his words fell like soft embers upon dry leaves. "We do not flee," he said quietly, his eyes sweeping the assembly of men and women. "Nor do we seek to throw ourselves against the stone walls of Roman legions. We will strike not where they expect, but where their armor leaves them blind." He devised a plan unlike any the Romans could have foreseen. Rather than retreat or meet the legions head-on, Spartacus divided his force into smaller bands, each led by trusted captains trained in the ways of silent movement and swift attack. These groups slipped into the countryside, vanishing into forests and shadowed valleys. They struck like lightning, ambushing Roman supply lines, setting upon isolated patrols, cutting down small detachments before melting away into the wilderness. It was a campaign of whispers and shadows, a war of 1,000 small cuts. The Roman legions, trained for open battle and grand maneuvers, found themselves chasing ghosts. Each victory Spartacus won was not marked by grand conquests, but by the slow, relentless erosion of Roman strength and morale. Days turned into weeks. The winter deepened, and with it, the frustration of the Roman commanders grew. They pressed harder, sending their forces further afield, stretching their lines thin in the hope of trapping the elusive rebel bands. But Spartacus anticipated each move with uncanny foresight. In one bold maneuver, Spartacus led a contingent of his most seasoned fighters against the baggage train of Gellius's army, a slow-moving column burdened with supplies and guarded by only a small force. The attack was swift and merciless. The Roman guards fell before they could raise a proper defense, and the slaves seized enough grain, arms, and coin to sustain their entire force through the harshest weeks of winter. Gellius, furious and humiliated, retaliated by sending a legion southward in pursuit. Spartacus, ever the tactician, allowed the legion to press deep into unfamiliar territory, only to spring an ambush amid a dense woodland where Roman formations dissolved beneath the weight of the land itself. The legion was shattered, its survivors fleeing in disarray. By the time the snows began to fall upon the highest peaks, Rome's twin consuls found themselves no closer to capturing Spartacus than when they had begun. Their armies, battered by constant harassment and weary from fruitless marches, withdrew to regroup. In the quiet that followed, Spartacus gathered his people once more. By firelight, beneath the dark sweep of the winter sky, he spoke to them, not as soldiers, but as free men and women standing on the edge of a world that had never imagined them as anything but property. "We have withstood Rome's best," he told them, "not because we are many, nor because we are mighty, but because we stand as one. We will go north, not to conquer, but to seek the freedom that lies beyond Rome's reach." The murmurs that followed were not cries of war, nor shouts of vengeance. They were the quiet voices of those who believed, truly believed, that a life without chains was worth any cost. And so, as the year turned and the first snowflakes drifted upon the wind, Spartacus prepared his people for the journey ahead. Northward, toward the Alps, toward the chance of escape beyond the grasp of Rome. But in the silent depths of his heart, Spartacus knew that their path would not be free of blood and sorrow. For Rome, humiliated and cornered, would not let its captives slip away without a final reckoning. The winter of waiting was ending. The storm was coming. The first pale fingers of spring reached out across the southern lands of Italy, coaxing tender green shoots from the frost-hardened earth. The snows began to melt upon the mountain peaks, their waters trickling into streams that sang quietly beneath the budding trees. Yet beneath this gentle awakening of the land, a restless energy stirred. an unseen current that moved with the shifting armies and whispered through the hearts of men and women who marched beneath the banner of Spartacus. For months, Spartacus had outmaneuvered the legions of Rome, weaving a path of defiance through Italy's southern reaches. With every skirmish won, every supply train seized, his legend grew, not just among the oppressed, but even within the walls of Rome itself. Senators spoke his name with clenched jaws, generals spat it like a curse, but none could deny that a former slave, a Thracian gladiator, had become a master of war Rome had failed to break. Now, as the earth softened beneath spring's touch, Spartacus turned his eyes northward. His goal was not conquest, nor the fleeting glory of battlefield triumphs. It was escape. Beyond the Alps lay lands untouched by the Roman yoke, Gaul, Germania, the free reaches where Rome's legions dared not tread with impunity. There, he believed, his people might scatter and find lives unbound by the chains of empire. The march north began in earnest beneath soft skies streaked with migrating clouds. They moved in a great, living river, thousands upon thousands of men, women and children, their ranks swelled by every slave who dared flee the estates and fields they passed. Some bore weapons captured from fallen Romans, others carried farming tools turned to war. Many had nothing but their hands and hearts, and yet they marched together, bound by a single thread, hope. As they moved, Spartacus kept a careful watch over the swelling tide of his followers. He sent out scouts ahead of the column, swift runners and seasoned hunters who moved like shadows among the hills. They brought back word of Roman movements, of villages friendly or hostile, of passes that lay open or blocked. With each report, Spartacus wove his plans anew. He chose roads less travelled, mountain paths where a Roman army would falter, and meadows where his people could rest without fear of sudden attack. His knowledge of the land, sharpened by months of evasion and battle, served as a shield no sword could break. Among his inner circle, the bonds grew deeper with each passing day. Gannicus, the fiery Celt known for his reckless courage, rode at Spartacus's side, a man whose laughter rang loud even in the darkest hours. Castus, a sharp-eyed Gaul, led the vanguard, his strategies swift and sure as a hawk's dive. And Oinomos, the silent rock among them all, remained Spartacus' trusted shadow, a sentinel against despair. Yet for all their strength, the dangers of such a vast migration grew with every mile. Food became a constant concern. Though the army took from the estates of Rome, they did so with restraint, refusing to descend into the pillaging hordes their enemies claimed them to be. Still, there were mouths to feed, so many mouths, and the land, though waking, gave only so much. Disease, too, lurked at the edges of their ranks. The long march and meagre fare wore upon the weaker among them. Spartacus moved among the sick as he did among the strong, ensuring they were cared for, refusing to abandon those who could not march as swiftly. In this, his heart remained steadfast. He would lead not a horde, but a people, and a people, he believed, left no one behind. But beyond hunger and illness, the greatest threat marched now in their shadow. Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest man, known as much for his insatiable greed as for his ruthless cunning, had at last stepped forward when the Senate found none else who could bear the burden of crushing Spartacus. Crassus did not command with the arrogance of consuls past. He brought with him 6 full legions and a heart colder than iron. Where others had underestimated Spartacus, Crassus did not. He studied his enemy's movements with the eye of a hunter tracking a cunning beast. He knew Spartacus sought the Alps, and with methodical precision, Crassus laid his trap, not with wild charges, but with calculated force. He built walls. Crassus ordered a line of fortifications stretched across the narrowest point of the Italian peninsula near Rhegium, a vast ditch and earthen wall, manned by legions and bristling with watchtowers. It was a barrier not just of earth and wood, but of intent, a declaration that Spartacus would not pass without a fight unlike any he had yet faced. The news reached Spartacus as they approached the southern tip of Italy, their path northward suddenly choked by Rome's hand. For the first time in many months, the road ahead seemed uncertain. His captains argued fiercely in council. Some called for an assault on the fortifications, others for a retreat to the mountains once more. Spartacus listened, his face unreadable beneath the flickering shadows of the fire. At last he spoke, a single, calm sentence that silenced the tent. "We will break through." It was not spoken as a boast, nor as a challenge. It was a simple truth, spoken by a man who had never allowed the chains of fear to clasp his heart. In the days that followed, Spartacus led raids upon the Roman lines, swift, fierce assaults that tested the defences of Crassus's walls. Night after night, small bands struck like wolves, harrying supply wagons, setting fire to outposts, vanishing before a full response could be mounted. Crassus's legions, drilled and disciplined, held fast. Yet they felt the pressure mounting, a relentless tension that gnawed at even the hardiest veteran. And then, in a single storm-laden night, Spartacus unleashed his plan. Using rafts hastily crafted from felled trees and tied reeds, he led a force across the stormy seas to the coast behind Crassus's lines. The Romans, their eyes fixed upon the walls, never saw the crossing until the rebel army surged upon them from the rear, an eruption of steel and fury that broke the Roman positions in a torrent of fire and blood. The breach was swift, decisive. Spartacus, sword in hand, led his people through the gap before Crassus could rally a response. By dawn, they had escaped the trap, a river of souls flowing northward once more, the storm of freedom refusing to be contained. Crassus, though furious, was neither broken nor humbled. He gave chase, his legions marching in grim silence upon the heels of the rebel host. The final chapter of their long struggle had begun, a dance of war that would stretch across the breadth of Italy, shadowed by the weight of fate and the relentless march of destiny. And Spartacus, though burdened by the knowledge of the storm yet to come, stood unbowed upon the threshold of the hardest road yet, a road that led toward freedom, or toward a legend that would never die. The wind swept cold across the high plains of central Italy, rustling the tall grasses and carrying with it the faint clang of marching feet. A soft, steady echo that merged with the sigh of the earth itself. Spartacus and his people moved northward, a living river of defiance winding its way toward the distant, snow-capped shoulders of the Alps. Their path lay uncertain, fraught with the silent weight of a shadow that followed their every step. Crassus and his legions relentless as the turning of the seasons. The breach of the Roman fortifications near Rhegium had brought them a fleeting taste of freedom. Yet Spartacus knew better than to believe in victory won too soon. Crassus had not fallen. The Roman machine, though wounded, was not broken, and now it marched with renewed fury. The rebel host moved as swiftly as the land allowed, threading through narrow passes and across the undulating hills that marked the heart of Italia. They left behind the richer southern lands and entered territories less yielding, regions of rocky soil and sparse villages where the earth gave grudgingly to those who tilled it. The burden of the march grew heavier with each passing day. Supplies dwindled. The weakest among them, children, the old, the sick, lagged at the edges of the column. And yet they moved forward. Spartacus did not retreat into the mountains, nor did he slow his march for fear of Roman pursuit. He pressed on, always forward, his heart set upon the thin, wavering hope that the Alps might yet offer escape, not just for himself, but for the thousands who followed him with eyes full of trust and hearts beating with fragile courage. By his side rode Gannicus, ever restless, his sharp eyes scanning the distant ridges for the telltale glint of Roman armor. Castus rode ahead with the vanguard, his scouts flitting between trees and hills like shadows beneath the wide sky. Immerse remained a steady presence, his silence a quiet reminder of the resolve that bound them together. The days passed in a rhythm of steady movement, marching by dawn, resting beneath the wide open sky by night. They crossed rivers swollen with spring's thaw, their feet sinking into cold mud as they pushed forward. The mountains loomed ever nearer, their jagged peaks like pale sentinels watching over the fate of all below. But the shadow of Crassus did not fade. Word came from scouts. Crassus was closing the distance. His legions, disciplined and tireless, pressed north with the iron will of a commander who neither hesitated nor relented. And though Spartacus moved swiftly, the burden of caring for thousands slowed him in ways no army ever could. On a rain-washed morning near the valley of the Metaurus River, Crassus struck. His legions descended with calculated ferocity, no wild charge, no reckless assault. They came in ordered ranks, shields locked, standards high, their formation a steel-clad wall that advanced with terrifying precision. The rebel scouts fell back, warning the main host, but Crassus had moved too swiftly, cutting off the retreat toward the mountains. Faced with the tightening jaws of the Roman trap, Spartacus called his captains together. They gathered beneath the dripping boughs of an ancient oak, the murmurs of the army's restless ranks a low hum in the misted distance. Gannicus, his brow furrowed, was the first to speak. "We cannot fight them here, not with so many mouths to protect. The land favours their legions." Oenomas nodded, his quiet gaze fixed upon the eastern ridges. "We must break their lines, cut a path before they close in." Castus tightened his grip upon the hilt of his sword. "A feint, then. Draw them to the centre while our strongest strike at their flank." All turned to Spartacus. He stood silent for a moment, listening to the soft patter of rain upon the leaves above. Then he spoke, his voice low even. "We will divide them, strike at their heart with a single blow, and make them feel the fury of those they thought would kneel forever." The plan was simple in its daring. Spartacus would lead the strongest fighters in a concentrated assault upon the Roman centre, cutting through with the speed and force of a hammer's fall. Meanwhile, Castus and Oenomas would flank the Roman wings, harrying them, drawing their strength away from the heart of the battle. Gannicus would hold the rear guard, ensuring the safety of the non-combatants and keeping an open path for retreat if all failed. As the grey light of morning broke, Spartacus mounted his horse, sword resting easily across his lap. He rode slowly along the ranks of his chosen warriors, men and women who had stood with him through the crucible of endless battles. Some bore swords, others axes, still others wielded nothing more than sharpened farming tools bound with strips of cloth. To each he gave no grand speech, no call to glory. Only a quiet nod, a silent bond shared among those who marched not for conquest, but for the hope of a life unchained. When the battle began, it unfolded like a storm breaking upon the fields. Spartacus's charge drove straight into the Roman lines, the clash of steel and the cries of battle merging into a single terrible roar. The rebels struck with a fury born not of hatred, but of the raw will to live. The Roman soldiers, though seasoned, reeled beneath the unexpected force of the assault. For a moment, a single, heart-stopping moment, it seemed the line might break. But Crassus had counted on this. With ruthless efficiency, he tightened his formations, reinforcing the threatened centre with reserves held in waiting. His men, drilled to perfection, locked shields and pressed forward, their lines absorbing the shock, and then beginning the slow, grinding push that Roman legions had mastered over centuries of war. The battle raged until the sun hung high in the sky, its pale light glinting off blood-slicked blades and shattered shields. Spartacus fought at the forefront, his sword rising and falling in a relentless rhythm, his breath steady, his heart a steady drumbeat amid the chaos. But even the fiercest storm meets its match in the unyielding cliffs. By late afternoon, the rebel lines began to falter, not for lack of courage, but under the sheer weight of Roman discipline and superior arms. Spartacus called the retreat with a voice that cut through the din, leading his fighters back toward the waiting ranks of Gannicus and the rear guard. They had struck a blow, a fierce, defiant blow, but the Roman line had held. As the sun dipped behind the western hills, Spartacus stood upon a ridge, watching as his people regrouped. They had escaped destruction for now. The Romans would follow, relentless as ever. And yet, in his heart, Spartacus felt no despair. They had faced Rome's greatest commander, met the iron wall of the Republic itself, and still they lived. The road ahead lay uncertain, shrouded in the gathering dusk of a world poised between hope and doom. But as long as breath filled their lungs, as long as the dream of freedom burned within their hearts, Spartacus knew they would march on. For they were not slaves, not anymore. They were free men and women walking the edge of the world, and they would not yield. The dusk deepened into a quiet, velvet night as Spartacus and his weary host withdrew beneath the sheltering shadows of a pine-clad ridge. The low hum of the forest whispered around them, the rustle of wind through boughs, the soft murmur of distant water. Here, far from the bloodied fields where Roman steel had clashed against their desperate charge, the army of the free gathered in silence. They tended their wounds in the faint glow of campfires kept small and discreet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and the faint tang of iron, the scent of battle not easily washed away. Spartacus moved among them without word or ceremony, laying a hand upon a shoulder here, clasping a wrist there, his silent presence a balm that words could not offer. In every face he saw reflections of the same fierce spark, wounded, yes, and wearied by the unending press of war, but unbroken. They had met the might of Crassus, stared into the iron heart of Rome, and emerged not as conquerors, nor as victims, but as men and women who refused to bow. That night, beneath the dark vault of stars, Spartacus gathered his captains, Gannicus, Castus, Immerse, and a few of the elder leaders whose wisdom had steadied them through the harshest trials. They met within a ring of stones, the flickering flame of a single torch casting long shadows upon their faces. "The legions will not rest," Gannicus said, his voice low but edged with that unquenchable fire. "Crassus will be upon us before the dawn." Immerse, silent for a long moment, nodded slowly. "He will press us until we fall, or until we turn and face him with all we have." Castus leaned forward, his gaze sharp as a drawn blade. "We have drawn blood, but not enough, and now we are caught between his hammer and the mountain's anvil." Spartacus listened, the quiet strength in his eyes steadying the anxious murmurs. Then, with a soft exhale, he spoke. "We cannot outrun them," he said, his voice soft as the night wind. "And we will not waste our lives in a war of shadows. It is time we struck in a way that Rome will never forget." A silence settled over the gathered men, the weight of his words falling like slow rain. Spartacus raised his eyes to the north, where the faint outline of the Apennines loomed dark against the starlit sky. "We move at dawn, toward Brundisium." The name fell upon them like a spark in dry tinder. Brundisium, a bustling port city upon the Adriatic Sea, gateway to the east, a Roman stronghold lined with merchant vessels, galleys, and the wealth of the Republic's trade. A city lightly defended by local forces, far from the front lines of Crassus's campaign. If Spartacus could seize it, he might bargain passage across the seas for his people, perhaps to Greece, or beyond, where Rome's reach weakened and new lands offered the hope of freedom. Gannicus was the first to smile, a slow, dangerous grin playing across his lips. "You would rob Rome of its pride and its harbour, and make the Senate tremble in their marble halls." Spartacus met his gaze, his eyes calm. "I would give our people a chance to escape this endless war, to live, to be free." Immerse inclined his head, silent but resolute. Castus gave a sharp nod, the fire of agreement sparking in his eyes. "Then we march before the dawn." And so the plan was set, not born of desperation, but of the quiet, steadfast hope that had carried them this far. The march began with the first whispers of light upon the eastern sky. Spartacus led his host eastward, slipping away from the pursuing legions of Crassus like mist before the sun. They moved with a silent urgency, the weary mingling with the steadfast, each step driven by the shared heartbeat of freedom's fragile hope. They crossed hills and valleys shrouded in the pale mists of morning, fording streams swollen with spring's thaw, pressing on even as their bodies cried for rest. The weak were carried, the sick tended, the weary strengthened by the simple presence of their brothers and sisters at their side. And always, Spartacus rode at the fore, not as a king upon a golden steed, but as a man among men, his eyes fixed upon the road ahead, his heart beating in quiet rhythm with those who followed him. As they neared Brundisium, word came from scouts. Crassus, realizing the shift in their path, had turned a portion of his legions in pursuit. The Roman commander, relentless as the tide, would not let his quarry slip beyond his grasp. Yet Spartacus did not waver. He pressed forward, setting a pace that tested the limits of endurance. By the time they reached the outskirts of Brundisium, their forces stood upon the edge of exhaustion, and yet the city lay before them, its harbour shimmering beneath the silver kiss of moonlight. But hope, as ever, proved a fleeting companion in a world shaped by iron and war. For Brundisium was not undefended. Crassus, foreseeing Spartacus's move, had sent a garrison to bolster the city's walls, legions hardened by the wars of the East, commanded by men loyal not just to the Senate, but to Crassus's personal cause. The gates were closed, the walls manned, the harbour sealed beneath the vigilant eyes of Roman archers and soldiers alike. Spartacus stood upon a rise overlooking the city, the cool wind of the sea brushing against his face. Behind him stretched the weary ranks of his people, their eyes fixed upon him with silent expectation. Gannicus approached, his voice low. They knew, They were waiting. Spartacus nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Crassus learns quickly, but so do we. The dream of crossing the seas slipped quietly from his grasp, yet Spartacus felt no bitterness. For in this war, as in life, victory was not always a prize won upon a single field or in a single hour. It was forged in the will to rise, again and again, against the weight of a world set against you. He turned back to his people and raised his voice, steady and clear. This is not our end. We have outrun the legions of Rome. We have defied Crassus, and we will do it again. We will march, northward now, back toward the mountains, back to where Rome fears to follow. A murmur rose among the people, not of despair, but of quiet resolve. They had placed their lives in the hands of a man who did not promise easy victories, but who never once led them into chains. And so, beneath the soft veil of night, Spartacus turned his army once more toward the dark horizon. The march would continue, the dream would endure. For as long as Spartacus walked this earth, hope would never die. The months turned slowly beneath the southern sun, and in the far reaches of the Italian countryside, whispers of Spartacus and his growing force began to trickle into the grand villas and modest farmhouses alike. In the 10th chapter of this quiet rebellion, the tale softens its voice to linger upon a turning season, a season not merely of the year but of hearts, fears and fateful decisions. Atop a gentle rise near the town of Nola, Spartacus stood in the pre-dawn hush, the world around him wrapped in a veil of mist that softened even the harshest outlines of the earth. The scent of damp grass and the faint perfume of olive groves mingled with the distant bleating of goats. His eyes, dark and unwavering, traced the soft glow of dawn unfurling across the eastern sky. Yet, as he watched the slow procession of light, his thoughts stirred deeper than the breaking day. It was here, on this quiet hill, that the shape of his rebellion began to change. Not in thunderous clash or sweeping declaration, but in the silent, almost imperceptible shift of hearts within his own camp. The men who followed him, a patchwork legion of former slaves, gladiators, peasants and fugitives, had begun to speak with new voices. They no longer whispered only of escape or vengeance. They spoke now of freedom with the reverent awe of those who had glimpsed its outline and could not bear to turn away. Spartacus moved quietly among the tents of his encampment that morning, his heavy cloak brushing against the dewy grass. Faces lifted to meet his gaze, faces marked by the hard lines of toil, by scars fresh and ancient, by eyes that flickered with something delicate and rare, hope. It was a fragile thing, not yet forged in the fires of certainty, but alive enough to draw them from their rest and toward their leader. Gannicus, ever the restless heart among them, met Spartacus near a dying campfire. His arms were crossed over his chest, his posture loose, but his eyes sharp as flint. "You have them now," Gannicus murmured, tilting his head toward the clusters of men beyond. Not merely their swords, their hearts. Spartacus regarded him with a quiet that seemed to settle over the earth itself. "I do not want their hearts bound to a dream that may die before it is born." Gannicus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Dreams are all any of us have, and theirs have long been chained and broken. You've given them a piece of their souls back. That is no small thing, Thracian." The words lingered in the air, as soft as the mist curling at their feet. Spartacus turned his gaze toward the growing light of dawn, a slow breath steadying within him. That morning, beneath the gentle hush of awakening earth, Spartacus gathered his men, not in shouted command nor in grandiose speech, but in a circle drawn wide upon the hillside. They came, one by one, drawn as much by silent curiosity as by loyalty. There were no banners, no formalities, only the low murmur of voices falling quiet as he raised his hand. He spoke then, not of war, nor of conquest, nor even of the legions that would soon march against them. He spoke of what had been stolen, of families torn apart beneath the lash, of names stripped away like so much dust upon the wind. He spoke of the weight of chains, of the ache of nights spent in cages, of the bitter taste of freedom glimpsed only beyond the reach of sword tips and slave markets. But most of all, Spartacus spoke of choice. He told them, with a voice soft as the rolling dawn, that they stood upon the edge of a world still unmade, that they, each soul among them, could choose to vanish into the shadows once more, flee into the distant hills, disappear across the seas, or stand together as something Rome had never known, free men who would not be broken. The silence that followed his words was not heavy nor strained. It was a silence born of something vast, something sacred, a space within each heart that stirred awake with a slow, reverent pulse. No cries of battle rose into the air, no swords lifted to the heavens. Only a quiet murmur passed among them, a ripple of shared resolve as gentle and profound as the tide. That day marked a quiet covenant, sealed not in blood but in understanding. They would stand, not because Spartacus commanded them, nor because hatred for Rome burned hotter than their fear, but because for the first time they felt the shape of their own will. In the weeks that followed, the camp became more than a gathering of fugitives. Tents grew sturdier, defences more deliberate. Men began to forge weapons with care rather than desperation. Women, freed alongside their brothers and husbands, brought knowledge of healing, of farming, of crafts long forbidden them in bondage. Children, born in the shadow of oppression, laughed openly under the wide sky. The rebellion, once a spark fleeing the wrath of Rome, became a living thing, an unwritten testament that freedom, though hunted, could root itself in even the most barren soil. Yet amid this soft blossoming, shadows lengthened. Word reached them of Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a shadowed figure of ambition and ruthlessness, being granted command of the legions. Unlike the bumbling senators and vanity-stricken generals before him, Crassus was a man who studied his prey before striking. He would not be drawn into careless traps, nor would he underestimate the heart of a rebel. Spartacus felt the shift in the wind long before the scouts returned with news of Roman maneuvers. He knew the days of quiet gathering, of whispered dreams and simple encampments were nearing their end. Yet even so, upon that soft hill near Nola, amidst a dawn both peaceful and foreboding, Spartacus allowed himself a single breath of fragile hope, a hope that perhaps the strength born in freedom might yet stand against the empire that believed all men could be bought or broken. In that dawn, among those who had known only chains, the quiet heart of a rebellion beat on, waiting for the storm. The days that followed moved like a hush before a gathering storm. The skies above the camp near Nola remained soft with summer's languor, yet beneath their calm expanse, hearts and hands stirred with growing urgency. The quiet conviction born on that hill had settled into the marrow of Spartacus's followers, weaving itself into the sinews of a force not merely of numbers, but of purpose. The rhythm of life within the encampment became something almost monastic in its quiet diligence. Men awoke before the first light to shape iron, mend armor, and hone their bodies through rigorous drills. There were no idle boasts, no careless laughter. Every movement was steeped in a sense of measured preparation. Theirs was a rebellion not of wild flames, but of embers carefully fanned, embers that would burn slow and deep when the winds of war came to claim them. Among these men, Spartacus remained less a commander than a silent center, a steady pulse within a living body. He moved through the ranks not with the authority of a master, but with the quiet attention of a brother in arms. He listened more than he spoke, his presence a reassurance to those who once knew only the weight of a master's gaze. On one such morning, the sky a soft wash of grey, Crixus approached him by the edge of a narrow stream winding past the encampment. The Gallic warrior bore the marks of hard years, scars mapping the curve of his arms, a furrow of old worry beneath his brow, but in his eyes flickered a loyalty wrought not of subservience, but of shared purpose. "They say Crassus marches," Crixus said, his voice a low murmur against the gentle sound of water over stone. Spartacus gave a faint nod. "He does." Crixus stared out over the slow-moving stream, the silence between them stretching soft as the morning mist. "He's no fool, that one. He won't come at us blind." "No," Spartacus agreed, his gaze resting upon the soft current. "He'll study us, wait for us to show our weakness, or give him a reason to press." Crixus exhaled slowly, a sound more thoughtful than anxious. "What will you do?" Spartacus let the question hang in the quiet air for a moment before answering. "What we have always done. We prepare and we endure." Crixus gave a slow, approving nod, though his eyes held a shadow of something more. A question left unspoken, a worry not yet named. But Spartacus did not press him. He understood well the quiet fears that crept upon even the bravest hearts when the wind shifted. The calm before the clash of armies often frayed even the strongest of resolves. That night, beneath a sky woven with stars, Spartacus called his most trusted companions, Gannicus, Crixus, Immerse, and a few others, into a simple gathering around a fire whose embers glowed low in the hush of dark. They sat close, their faces soft with the kind of honest wariness known only to those who have walked too long on the edge of fate. "There will come a time," Spartacus began softly, "when we must choose more than where to stand. We must choose why." The others listened, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the pause that followed. "We have struck Rome's pride, torn holes in her veil of invincibility," he continued, his voice slow, steady. "But pride alone is not a victory. Freedom is not taken by sword alone, nor can it be given. It must be lived, claimed in each heart." Immerse, ever the stern voice of wisdom among them, leaned forward slightly. "And when Crassus comes with his legions, what then? How do we claim freedom in the shadow of death?" Spartacus met his gaze with a quiet fire of his own. "We show them that we are not slaves rebelling out of rage, but men standing out of will. We do not fight for vengeance, but for a life beyond chains." The words settled over them like a soft mantle, each man drawing them in as embers of resolve. In the days that followed, subtle changes rippled through the camp. The drills took on a new edge of precision. The gathering of supplies became a careful art. Scouts moved with a sharpened sense of purpose, weaving silent threads of knowledge from the lands beyond their haven. They marked the roads, watched the movement of Roman patrols, and learned the language of the land in a way no map could ever teach. And through it all, Spartacus remained a quiet constant, a figure who spoke sparingly, yet whose every glance carried the weight of their shared dream. He trained alongside them, slept among them, bled with them in drills that left muscles aching and spirits sharpened. He did not hold himself apart, nor seek the trappings of a leader. He simply stood, and by standing became the heart they all turned toward. Then came the scouts, returning one evening with news that settled upon the camp like a whispered storm. Crassus was on the move. The legions, disciplined and vast, had begun their slow, deliberate march southward. They did not come in haste, nor with the reckless fury of earlier commanders. They came with the inexorable press of a tide drawn by a master tactician, a tide that would not break upon rocks or falter before a charge. Around the low burning fires, the murmurs began. Some spoke of fleeing, of taking to the hills, scattering like leaves before the wind. Others spoke of standing firm, of making a final stand worthy of song and memory. But Spartacus said nothing that night. Instead, as the camp drifted toward uneasy rest, he walked alone to the edge of their encampment, where the land fell away into a darkened valley. The air was cool against his skin, the scent of earth rich beneath the blanket of stars. There in the hush of night, he let his thoughts flow like the silent river below. He thought of Thrace, of the sunlit hills of his youth, the laughter of comrades long fallen. He thought of Sura, her face a soft ghost that lingered in the quiet spaces of his heart. And he thought of freedom, not as a banner to be raised, nor a victory to be seized, but as a fragile living thing that breathed within each man who dared to dream. A soft wind stirred the hem of his cloak, carrying with it the faint murmur of his people resting in uneasy sleep behind him. In that moment, Spartacus understood with a clarity as quiet and profound as the stars above. The storm was coming. But storms, for all their fury, could never crush the roots that held fast beneath the earth. He would not flee, nor would he surrender to the tides of fate. He would stand, and with him, a dream that even Rome could not silence. Morning unfolded with a hush that belied the heavy weight pressing upon the hearts of the men encamped beneath the southern hills. The early light spilled soft and golden across the land, casting long shadows over tents neatly arranged in quiet order. The songs of birds stirred faintly in the olive groves beyond, yet within the camp, no voice rose in greeting, no laughter met the day. It was a morning held in breath, a world waiting at the edge of knowing. Spartacus rose before the sun, his footsteps silent upon the dew-touched earth. The stillness wrapped around him like a second skin, and as he walked among the silent shapes of sleeping men, his thoughts stirred with a calm born not of ignorance but of resolve, tested against the slow, grinding wheel of fate. He knew what this day would bring, not the clash of swords, not yet, but something deeper. a decision to be sealed in the quiet hearts of his people, before the first Roman spear pierced the earth. Near the eastern edge of the encampment, where a line of slender cypress trees swayed softly in the dawn breeze, Gannicus stood alone, his back turned toward the rising light. He held no sword, no shield, only a simple staff resting across his shoulders, his arms draped over it in a posture both relaxed and reflective. Spartacus joined him without a word. For a time, they stood in companionable silence, the hush between them filled only with the low sigh of wind through the cypress leaves. At length Gannicus spoke, his voice a quiet murmur that seemed part of the morning itself. "You know they fear him." Spartacus nodded once, his gaze fixed upon the faint outline of distant hills. "They should." Gannicus tilted his head slightly, a faint curve touching his lips. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. And yet here we stand, as though the legions were but a shadow passing in the wind. Spartacus let out a slow breath, his voice soft but certain. Because fear does not decide a man's path, will does. The words hung in the air, delicate as the shimmering haze of dawn. Gannicus gave a soft grunt of approval, tapping the end of his staff against the ground with a thoughtful nod. "Then you mean to meet him head-on?" Spartacus did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes traced the gentle curves of the land before them, the soft rise and fall of hills, the winding course of a narrow stream, the silent stand of trees beyond. His mind moved over the terrain with the quiet care of a craftsman shaping stone. "I mean to choose the ground upon which we stand," he said at last, his voice low, "not as hunted men, but as free men who will not kneel." Gannicus gave a soft, knowing chuckle. "You'll have us bleed for every inch." A faint smile touched Spartacus' lips, soft, fleeting. "No, I'll have us live for every inch." As the sun climbed higher, Spartacus gathered his captains, not with fanfare nor shouted summons, but with a simple gesture, a quiet meeting beneath the open sky. They came in ones and twos, the quiet core of a rebellion forged in the fires of shared suffering and tempered in the slow rising heat of purpose. Around them the camp began to stir, not with panic, nor with fevered preparation, but with a quiet rhythm that spoke of hearts already settled into the cadence of the day to come. Swords were sharpened, shields checked and mended, arrows counted and bows restrung. The air carried the soft sounds of preparation, a symphony of quiet resolve. Spartacus spoke little during that gathering. He did not draw lines upon maps, nor speak of grand strategies to dazzle eager ears. Instead, he spoke of the land, of the places where the hills narrowed, where the trees grew thick enough to shelter hidden movements, where the earth gave way beneath unsuspecting feet. He spoke of how they would not meet Crassus in open battle, where the strength of Roman discipline could grind them beneath its iron tread. Nor would they scatter to the winds, inviting death by slow, inevitable hunt. They would move with the land, bend with its curves, rise with its shelter. They would become a shadow against the advancing storm, a shadow that struck with precision, disappeared into mist, and returned before the enemy could draw breath. And as he spoke, the eyes that met his did not flicker with fear, nor narrow with doubt. They held the steady gleam of men who had tasted the whip, had learned to kneel, and had chosen at last to stand. By midday the camp moved, not in flight nor in reckless march, but in a flowing, quiet exodus that seemed more a part of the land than a disturbance upon it. Tents were struck with care, supplies gathered with deliberate hands. Children rode quietly atop carts laden with food and tools. Women moved among the men with calm efficiency, their faces soft with a resolve that needed no words. Spartacus walked among them, offering no orders beyond simple nods, no speeches beyond soft words exchanged in passing. He touched a shoulder here, offered a quiet look there, a silent thread weaving a tapestry of calm purpose that held them together even as the shadow of Rome pressed ever closer. As the sun reached its zenith, a faint scout's signal echoed from the distant ridge, a soft, bird-like call, barely distinguishable from the natural chorus of the land. Crassus was near. The legions had crossed into the valley beyond, their march a silent thunder rolling over the horizon. The moment hung in the air, a quiet, expectant pause before the world shifted. Spartacus stood upon a low rise, his gaze tracing the distant hills where the first shimmer of Roman standards pierced the horizon. He felt no rush of blood, no surge of fear, only a profound, quiet certainty. They would not meet them in battle today, nor would they run. They would move as the wind, present, unseen, unbroken. And so, beneath the hush of a summer sky, Spartacus gave a simple signal. A hand lifted, a single finger pointed eastward. The great silent column of freed men and women turned as one, their movements soft as the hush of falling leaves, slipping into the gentle embrace of the hills beyond. Behind them, the shadow of Rome stretched long and dark. But before them, the quiet path of their own choosing waited beneath a sky wide and free. The sun sank slowly upon the hills, casting its golden farewell over the winding path where Spartacus and his people moved in a quiet procession. They did not hurry, nor did they falter. Theirs was a march neither of retreat nor of reckless advance, but of patient resolve, a measured movement in rhythm with the land that sheltered them. Beneath the long shadows of ancient oaks, their footsteps fell soft upon the earth, muffled by the hush of evening air. The carts creaked gently under the weight of provisions. The soft clatter of arms mixed with the low murmur of hushed voices. It was a strange sight, a silent caravan that bore the heart of a rebellion within it, yet moved with the quiet dignity of pilgrims on a solemn journey. Among them walked Spartacus, his pace steady, his eyes keen beneath the dark fall of his cloak's hood. He spoke little, his attention flowing over the faces of those who shared this winding exodus, faces marked by weariness, by quiet determination, by something deeper still, a fragile hope not yet named. As twilight softened the edges of the world, Crixus joined him at a bend in the narrow woodland path. The Gaul's heavy frame moved with practiced ease, his hand resting lightly upon the hilt of his sword. Yet there was no swagger in his step, no fire in his eyes, only a steady, thoughtful calm. "We've put leagues between us and Crassus," Crixus murmured, his voice a low hush amid the soft chorus of the woods. "But he'll follow. Always he'll follow." Spartacus gave a small nod, his gaze never straying from the road ahead. "As the hunter follows the deer, but we are not prey, Crixus, and he is not the hunter he believes himself to be." A faint smile touched the corner of Crixus's lips. "Then what are we?" Spartacus turned his head slightly, his voice quiet, yet edged with quiet fire. "We are men who choose where we stand and when." Crixus fell silent, the weight of those words settling softly between them. The path narrowed then, curving into a gentle rise where the trees gave way to open sky. From this vantage, the valley below spread out in soft hues of fading light, fields brushed with gold, the shimmer of a distant river threading its slow course through the land. It was there, upon that rise, that Spartacus signalled for a halt. The people gathered in a quiet semicircle behind him, men, women, even children, all eyes lifted toward the soft expanse of open land below. They stood in silence, the hush of twilight wrapping them in a shared stillness. For a long moment, no word passed between them. Only the soft breath of wind stirred their cloaks, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and distant water. Then Spartacus spoke, his voice gentle, carrying on the hush like a soft echo of the earth itself. "This land, this valley, will see our choice," he said, his eyes sweeping over the waiting faces. "Not tomorrow, not when Rome forces our hand, tonight." A murmur stirred among them, a ripple of soft, uncertain voices, but Spartacus raised a quiet hand, and silence returned as swift as it had broken. "We do not run," he continued softly, "nor do we charge like beasts into a net. We choose our ground. We make it ours, before Rome lays her hand upon it." The meaning of his words settled upon the assembly like the first touch of rain upon dry earth. Understanding dawned in quiet glances exchanged among the men, in the soft, firming lines around the eyes of the women. This was not a flight. It was a gathering, a quiet, deliberate forging of a stand. That night, as darkness deepened, the quiet camp they made was unlike those before. There were no fires to draw watchful eyes, no careless laughter to rise into the night sky. The sentries moved with silent precision, their watchfulness sharpened by the quiet presence of their leader among them. The soft rhythm of preparation filled the air, a low murmur of sharpening blades, of shields checked and positioned, of quiet plans shared beneath the hush of the stars. Spartacus moved among them with a calm that settled hearts. He helped lift the heavier stones for makeshift defences, guided the placement of lookouts along the soft crest of the ridge. He listened as old soldiers offered quiet counsel, nodded as women skilled in herbs laid their healing tools within easy reach. There was no show of command, no need for raised voices. His presence was enough, a silent current that drew all into its steady flow. As the moon climbed high, its pale light tracing silver paths upon the earth, Gannicus joined Spartacus by the edge of a shallow ravine that marked the northern approach to the valley. "You mean to hold them here?" Gannicus asked, his voice a soft thread in the night. Spartacus nodded once. "Here, and wherever else they believe us weak." A soft chuckle escaped Gannicus. "A bold choice, Thracian." Spartacus met his gaze with the faintest glimmer of quiet certainty. "A choice that is ours." They fell into companionable silence, the soft rustle of the night around them a living presence. The land felt close, almost watching, its quiet heart beating with their own. By dawn, the ground would bear witness to the choice of free men. And though Crassus and his legions would march with banners high and armor gleaming, they would find no broken fugitives waiting. They would find a people who had chosen their stand. And in that simple, quiet choice, the heart of a rebellion would root itself deeper than even Rome's iron hand could reach. The night stretched on, gentle and waiting, as Spartacus and his people stood watch beneath a sky wide and endlessly free. The morning rose with a solemn grace, its soft light filtering through thin strands of mist that clung low across the valley. The air carried the faint chill of dawn, a quiet reminder of the world's turning even as the hearts of men turned within themselves. Spartacus stood at the eastern ridge, his silhouette outlined against the gentle blush of the sky. His hands rested lightly upon the hilt of his sword, the blade sheathed, its presence more a symbol of readiness than a threat to be brandished. Behind him, the camp stirred into a silent awakening. There were no shouted commands, no hurried movements. Instead, a quiet, purposeful rhythm pulsed through the ranks, a living current of men and women who moved with the ease of those who had long accepted the weight of their task. They did not prepare for battle with the fever of those fearing death, nor with the blind zeal of those seeking glory. They prepared with the soft, steady heartbeat of those choosing to live, and if need be, to stand unbroken before the storm. Crixus oversaw the placing of stakes along the shallower approach to the ridge. His broad shoulders stooped beneath the weight of logs moved by his own hands. His voice, low and firm, guided others with quiet authority. There was no need for barked orders. Each man who worked beside him felt the measure of his resolve in the steady cadence of his words. On the western slope, Gannicus moved with a silent grace, his steps sure-footed as he set small traps along the game trails, a simple line of snares and pitfalls designed not for slaughter, but for the careful slowing of a foe unwise enough to underestimate them. He worked with a faint smile curling at the edge of his lips, his heart oddly light in the face of looming threat. For Gannicus, the dance of survival was an art, and this stage, set by the quiet hand of Spartacus, was a theatre unlike any he had known. In the heart of the camp, Immerse moved with the quiet dignity of a priest at a sacred rite. He checked each line of defence, offered soft words of counsel to the younger men, his presence a calming shadow beside them. Those who trembled at the thought of the coming clash found steadiness in the quiet nod of his head, the soft weight of his hand upon their shoulder. The old gladiator carried within him the silent wisdom of one who had faced death and found in it not an end but a reason. And among them all, Spartacus remained a still point, a centre from which all quiet courage seemed to flow. As the sun lifted higher, its light soft upon the earth, a faint shimmer of movement stirred upon the horizon. The glint of sunlight upon bronze and steel, the faint suggestion of banners fluttering in the slow morning wind. The legions had come. A murmur stirred along the ridge, a ripple of quiet voices, a shifting of eyes toward the advancing shadow. But there was no panic, no rush of fear, only the soft drawing of breath, the tightening of grips upon sword hilts and spear shafts, the hearts of free men beating in quiet, steady rhythm. Spartacus stepped forward, his gaze resting calmly upon the distant lines. "They will come as they always do," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach those near, "with banners high, with drums of war, with the belief that we are less than men." He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping over the faces drawn close, a gathering of warriors, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, sons. His voice remained soft, yet each word held the quiet weight of stone. Let them come, let them believe. A faint smile touched his lips, not of mockery nor of defiance, but of simple, enduring truth. For we know what they do not, that a free heart cannot be broken by sword or chain. The words settled over them, soft as falling leaves, and a quiet murmur of assent stirred among the gathered. Not a shout, not a roar, only the soft, shared breath of men and women who had chosen their place in the world. As the Roman legions began their slow, deliberate approach across the valley floor, the first rays of full morning light caught the edges of their shields and helmets, sending brief flashes of gold across the land. They moved with the precision of a force long drilled, their formation a living wall of iron and will. Yet Spartacus did not flinch, nor did the men who stood beside him. They watched, silent, steady, as the shadow of Rome drew closer. And then, as quietly as the dawn itself, Spartacus gave a single nod. It was enough. The signal passed along the line, not in shouted words but in soft gestures, in the silent movement of hands. The first line of freedmen shifted slightly, their shields lifted, their eyes steady upon the slow approaching tide. Archers moved into hidden positions within the tree line, their bows strung with careful precision. The defenders upon the ridge settled into place, their breathing slow, their gazes clear. They did not charge. They did not break. They waited, for they knew that in the stillness before the clash, in the quiet choice to stand upon their own soil with hearts unchained, they had already begun to shape a victory deeper than any Roman banner could claim. The morning held its breath, the world pausing in a hush of golden light, and beneath the vast, unbroken sky, the free hearts of a people stood waiting, silent and unafraid. The sun drifted higher, tracing slow arcs over the valley floor, as if reluctant to bear witness to what the day might bring. The Roman legions advanced with the precision of a living machine, each step falling in rhythm with the silent drumbeat of years of conquest. Standards fluttered at the fore, marked with the proud insignias of Rome's finest houses, the silent heralds of a power that had crushed kingdoms and broken empires. Yet across the soft rise of the ridge, where wildflowers swayed amid sharpened stakes and carefully placed stones, the gathered host of Spartacus stood as a quiet contradiction. They bore no uniform banners, no matching shields, no gilded armor. Their line was a tapestry of many faces and fates, gladiators with weathered swords, farmers gripping hunting spears, women bearing bows crafted by their own hands. But in the hush of morning, their hearts beat as one. Crixus paced slowly behind the forward line, his gaze lingering on each face he passed, a quiet word here, a steadying hand there, small acts that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken bonds. He stopped beside a young man whose spear trembled slightly in his grip, laying a heavy hand upon his shoulder. "You stand among brothers," Crixus said quietly, "and no brother lets another fall." The young man nodded, his jaw firming, the tremor fading from his hand. Elsewhere, Gannicus moved with a different ease, a half-smile touching his lips, a faint gleam of playful defiance in his eyes. He paused beside a small knot of archers, hidden amid a copse of slender trees, giving them a soft wink. "When the Romans draw near," he murmured, "aim for their hearts, though I doubt they have any." A soft ripple of subdued laughter stirred among the archers, brief but enough to loosen the weight upon their spirits. At the heart of it all, Spartacus remained still upon the ridge, his gaze never leaving the approaching legions. His hands rested loosely at his sides, his posture as calm as though he stood watching a quiet sunrise instead of the slow advance of Rome's finest. His heart was a deep, steady drum, slow, certain, unyielding. Immerse joined him then, his step as silent as the wind. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They stood side by side, watching as the Roman lines began to unfurl with the grace of a serpent preparing to strike. At last, Immerse broke the silence. "Do you believe they see us, as men?" Spartacus answered without turning his head. "They see what they have always seen, tools to be used, lives to be bought, bones to be broken. And yet here we stand," Immerse murmured. Spartacus gave a slow nod. "And that, my friend, is what they cannot understand." The Roman commander, one of Crassus's trusted lieutenants, rode at the head of the legion, his armor gleaming in the soft morning light. His expression was unreadable, his posture the embodiment of Roman discipline. He lifted his hand, a signal passing like a ripple through the iron ranks behind him. The legions halted. A hush deeper than silence settled over the valley. From atop the ridge, Spartacus watched as a single rider emerged from the Roman ranks, bearing a white banner, an offer of parley, or perhaps a summons for surrender masked in the trappings of civility. The rider advanced at a measured pace, the soft thud of hooves carrying through the air like a distant heartbeat. Around Spartacus, the line of freedmen held steady, eyes watching with a quiet mixture of curiosity and wary expectation. When the Roman envoy reached the base of the ridge, he drew his horse to a halt, lifting his voice with the smooth, practiced cadence of one used to command. By order of Marcus Licinius Crassus, legate of Rome and master of her legions, you are summoned to surrender your arms and submit to the mercy of Rome. Lay down your weapons now, and you shall be spared the wrath of the empire. The words drifted upward, carried upon the soft wind. For a heartbeat, no answer came. Only the quiet murmur of wind in the grass, the steady breathing of those who stood upon the ridge. Then Spartacus stepped forward, his movements unhurried, his voice calm as the hush of dawn. Tell Crassus, he paused, letting the words settle into the waiting air, that we are no longer his to summon. The envoy sat stiff upon his mount, a flicker of uncertainty shadowing his eyes. If you resist, you will face the full might of the Roman legions. There will be no mercy. Spartacus met his gaze with a quiet that felt older than the hills themselves. We have not asked for mercy, nor shall we. The Roman envoy hesitated, then wheeled his horse sharply, turning back toward the distant ranks. The hush remained unbroken. Behind Spartacus, a quiet ripple passed among the ranks, a breath, a silent exhale, a settling of hearts. They would stand, not as fugitives, not as broken slaves, but as men. The envoy's return to the Roman lines sparked a movement within the legion, a slow, deliberate shift as the ranks prepared to advance. The formation tightened, the gleam of drawn swords catching the rising sun. Upon the ridge, Spartacus turned to his people, his voice a soft murmur carried by the wind. We stand here, by our choice. No shout answered him, no roar of battle lust, only a soft shared nod, a silent covenant deeper than any oath. As the Roman legions began their advance, the earth beneath their feet trembling with the weight of 1,000 armoured strides, the free hearts upon the ridge held their ground. And in that moment, beneath the wide, endless sky, the quiet heart of a rebellion beat louder than the drums of war. The Roman legions moved forward with a relentless precision, their shields interlocked, their spears gleaming like a silent tide of iron pressing across the valley floor. Dust rose beneath their marching feet, curling in soft spirals against the still air. The standards of Crassus swayed high above their ranks, bearing the proud emblems of Rome's indomitable will. But atop the ridge, Spartacus and his companions remained unmoved. The wind stirred gently at the hem of his cloak as he stood before his people, his hand resting lightly upon the hilt of his sword. The world seemed to narrow into a single breathless moment. A stillness stretched taut as the line between storm and sky. Beside him, Gannicus tilted his head slightly, watching the slow advance with a wry glimmer in his eyes. They march as if they intend to crush the very earth beneath their heels. Spartacus gave a soft breath that might have been a quiet laugh. Let them try. At his other side, Oenomaus leaned forward, his eyes sharp beneath the curve of his brow. Our time will come, Spartacus. But not yet. Spartacus nodded. Not yet. The legion continued its measured approach, a living wall of iron and discipline. They advanced without haste, each step calculated, each formation shifting with the cold elegance of a force that had bent nations beneath its tread. The watchers upon the ridge remained silent, eyes steady, hearts firm. It was then, when the Romans reached the shallow ravine Spartacus had marked, that the first thread of the plan began to unfurl. From within the undergrowth flanking the ravine, hidden beneath carefully arranged branches and leaves, a soft rustle stirred the air. A single arrow whispered forth from the shadows. It sang through the quiet morning, swift and silent, before embedding itself in the throat of a Roman centurion at the front of the column. The man fell without a sound, his hand clawing at the shaft, even as his knees buckled beneath him. The formation halted for a fraction of a breath. Then, from both sides of the ravine, a hail of arrows erupted, a sudden, whispering storm of death raining down upon the exposed legionaries. Archers hidden among the trees released with calm precision, their movements flowing in the practiced rhythm of long days spent in preparation. Each shaft found its mark: throats, gaps between shields, soft spaces beneath armoured joints. The Roman line recoiled slightly, a ripple of surprise passing through the rigid ranks. But even then, they did not falter. The centurions barked sharp commands, shields lifted, testudo formations snapping into place with mechanical discipline. The iron wall reshaped itself beneath the rain of arrows, the gleam of bronze and steel locking tight against the sky. Spartacus watched, his expression unreadable. "They learn quickly," he murmured. Crixus gave a low grunt. "Let them. They'll find we have more to teach." As the Romans pressed forward undeterred by the sudden assault, the ground beneath them gave its first quiet betrayal. A line of sharpened stakes, hidden beneath the soft earth of the ravine floor, caught the advance of the foremost soldiers. Men stumbled, fell upon the deadly points, their cries sharp but quickly swallowed by the press of bodies behind them. The advance slowed, faltered, yet still, the legions pushed on. Rome had not built her empire upon the mercy of hesitation, and Spartacus had not set his hopes upon a single snare. At his signal, a simple gesture of his hand, the second phase unfolded. From the flanks, where the gentle slopes of the valley rose in soft curves, small groups of freedmen emerged. They moved with practiced swiftness, striking at the Roman lines with sudden, precise attacks, before fading once more into the embrace of the trees. Their weapons flashed in brief, deadly arcs, short swords, spears, axes, before vanishing like whispers upon the wind. It was not an assault meant to break the legion. It was a test, a slow unravelling of the iron discipline that bound them. And within the ranks of the Romans a different kind of murmur stirred, a soft, almost imperceptible question creeping into the eyes of soldiers long accustomed to foes who charged blindly or broke at the first clash. These men did neither. They struck where the legions were weakest. They vanished before they could be caught. They moved not as an army, but as the land itself. Upon the ridge, Spartacus watched it unfold with a quiet, patient gaze. His heart beat in slow, steady rhythm, not with the reckless surge of a warrior rushing into battle, but with the calm of a man who understood the shape of the storm before it broke. Beside him, Gannicus exhaled softly, the faintest edge of a smile touching his lips. "You think Crassus watches this?" Spartacus nodded. "He watches, and he waits to see if we are fools. And when he sees we are not." Spartacus allowed himself a faint, quiet smile. "Then he will wonder what else we are." The Roman lines tightened once more, the advance resuming with renewed determination. The traps and ambushes had slowed them, yes, but they had not stopped them. Yet Spartacus did not look for victory in their halting steps. He looked for something deeper, the seed of doubt, the quiet crack in the heart of certainty. As the legions pressed forward into the narrowing jaws of the valley, Spartacus turned his gaze to the higher slopes beyond, where the final act of this quiet battle waited in silent readiness. There, hidden among the thickest stands of trees, a second force of freedmen lay in wait, silent, unseen. They would not charge until the earth beneath the Romans' feet grew soft with the weight of their own advance. Spartacus stood upon the ridge, his hands at his sides, his heart steady. And as the sun rose higher over the valley of choice, the quiet heart of his rebellion beat on, patient, watchful, unafraid. The sun arched higher in the soft blue sky, its light casting long, slender shadows across the valley, where steel and silence vied for dominion. The Roman legions pressed forward, their advance slow but unyielding, like a tide against a patient shore. Each step they took seemed to bear the weight of centuries of conquest, the echo of countless foes who had knelt before the might of the empire. But this morning, on this quiet field far from the marble halls of Rome, the legions met an enemy unlike any they had faced, a force that moved with the land, that struck with the precision of wind and shadow. Spartacus stood upon the ridge, his eyes tracing the shifting formations below. His heart remained a steady drum within his chest, not quickened by the sight of Roman discipline, nor shaken by the certainty of their power. He understood the heart of his enemy, its pride, its certainty in its own invincibility, and it was within that heart he now aimed his quiet blade. As the Romans advanced into the narrowing valley, the trap drew tighter. The flanking attacks continued, not as full assaults, but as deft, cutting strikes aimed at the soft points along the Roman line. A centurion fell here, a standard-bearer there. Always from the shadows, always with precision. The legions responded with ruthless efficiency. Orders barked in sharp Latin rang across the field. Cohorts adjusted, shields locked tighter. The Roman machine adapted, as it always did. But Spartacus did not seek to break them with blades alone. He sought to draw them deeper, into the heart of a waiting storm. By midday, the valley had become a living maze of skirmishes and sudden strikes. The Roman commanders, growing wary of the unseen attacks, pressed their men harder, forcing them forward with shield walls tight and swords ready. The testudo formations shifted, advancing in slow, grinding steps over ground now slick with the blood of their fallen. Yet every pace gained by the legions felt like a concession rather than a victory, a ground won not by conquest, but by stubborn march against an enemy that refused to play by the rules of Roman warfare. Atop the higher slope to the east, Gannicus crouched beside a cluster of archers, his eyes sharp beneath the shade of a cypress. He watched as the Roman front drew closer to the narrowest throat of the valley, where the terrain pressed tight between two rising banks of stone. He gave a low whistle, barely audible. Closer, a little closer. Beside him, the archers knocked their arrows, waiting with the stillness of hawks poised for flight. Farther along the slope, Immerse positioned the final flanking groups, men armed not with swords but with stones, nets, and ropes. They crouched in silence, waiting for his signal. The Romans moved into the throat of the valley with grim determination. The ground beneath their feet was firm, the slopes on either side rising in silent watchfulness. Their commanders rode at the rear, urging them forward with curt gestures and sharp commands. It was then, as the first ranks reached the midpoint of the narrowing pass, that Spartacus moved, a soft, barely perceptible signal. A hand raised, two fingers closing. The valley answered. From the higher slopes, a rain of arrows and stones poured down upon the Roman lines. The archers loosed with practiced rhythm, their shafts falling in tight, deadly arcs. The stones, hurled by strong arms from the shadows of the trees, battered against helmets and shields. The Romans instinctively tightened formation, shields locking, heads ducking. The advance slowed, staggered. Then came the nets. From hidden positions along the ridge, the freedmen cast their weighted nets with swift, deadly accuracy. The heavy ropes tangled around the front ranks, dragging down soldiers caught unaware. Shields locked in formation became a hindrance as men stumbled over one another, trying to cut free. In that single, breathless moment, the Roman advance faltered. Spartacus gave the next signal, a sharp, sweeping motion. From both flanks, his fighters surged forward, not in a reckless charge, but in a swift, coordinated strike. They moved with the confidence of men who knew every rise, every hollow of the land beneath their feet. Their blades found the gaps in the Roman lines, their strikes landing with brutal precision before melting away into the shadows once more. The legionaries fought back with disciplined fury, their training pushing them to adapt, to rally. But in the narrow throat of the valley, their numbers worked against them. The tight formation became a trap, each man penned in by comrades on every side. The iron wall that had crushed so many foes now served as a prison, binding them to the slow, grinding heart of a battle they could not control. From atop the ridge, Spartacus watched it all unfold with a quiet intensity. He felt the shifting pulse of the battle, the slow erosion of Roman certainty, the creeping rise of something deeper than victory. Doubt. The legions pressed on, but their advance became a crawl, their formation a shifting, stumbling beast. Every foot gained was a cost in blood and breath, every fallen comrade a silent wound in the heart of Roman pride. And Spartacus knew the longer they bled, the deeper the doubt would root itself within them. He gave a slow, steady nod, his voice a soft murmur beneath the hush of wind. Let them feel the weight of a free man's will. The sun burned high overhead, casting its golden light upon a battlefield unlike any Rome had prepared for. A battlefield shaped not by iron and empire, but by the quiet, relentless choice of those who refused to kneel. And as the shadow of the legions pressed forward, they marched not into a conquest, but into a quiet storm that would not break. The long hours of midday passed with the slow, grinding certainty of stone against stone. The valley echoed with the muted clash of steel, the low thud of arrows striking shields, and the subdued cries of men entangled in the quiet, deadly dance of ambush and retreat. Yet amid this storm of muted violence, Spartacus stood unmoved upon the crest of the ridge. The sun cast a pale halo behind him as he gazed over the battlefield, his hands folded before him, his expression carved from calm resolve. His people fought with the precision of those who understood not merely battle, but patience. The Roman legions continued their advance, though what had begun as a confident march had slowed into a wary crawl. The tight corridors of the valley became a silent adversary, its steep sides hemming them in, its narrow passage choking their movement. Cohorts that thrived on space and formation now found themselves compressed, their shields a burden, their spears clumsy in the cramped quarters. Above them, the archers of Spartacus's band kept a steady rhythm, losing not volleys of blind aggression, but measured shots aimed with the deliberation of hunters. Each arrow was a whisper of resistance, each falling stone a soft echo of a will unbroken. Gannicus moved among the forward ranks of freedmen like a shadow, his steps light, his sword flashing in brief, lethal arcs. He struck and faded, a soft grin ever haunting the corner of his mouth. He fought not with the fury of vengeance, but with the poise of a man dancing on the edge of the world, each motion a silent poem to freedom. Nearby, Crixus stood as a wall unto himself, shoulder to shoulder with his men, his axe cleaving in slow, brutal sweeps that broke shield and bone alike. Yet even in his strength there was a quiet discipline, a refusal to be drawn into reckless bloodlust. Every blow, every step was measured, as though each act of defiance were a stone laid upon the foundation of something larger than the moment. On the higher slope, Oenomaus moved with the grace of a man who had lived long in the shadow of death. His commands were soft but firm, his eyes never leaving the Roman lines. He watched as cracks formed, not in the armor, nor in the shields, but in the subtle shifts of posture, the hesitation of men who marched forward with less certainty than before. It was there, in those small signs, the slight lag of a cohort, the faint tremor in a centurion's barked command, that the heart of Spartacus's plan took root. The battle was not for the ground they stood upon, it was for the hearts of those who marched against them. By mid-afternoon, the Roman advance had stalled. The legionaries found themselves mired in a strange, suffocating contest, a battle not of grand charges, but of slow erosion. Each step forward was met with a shadow's retreat, each gap filled with sudden, sharp resistance. The valley floor, littered with the wounded and the fallen, became a silent testament to the futility of their march. Spartacus gave a quiet signal, a gesture unseen by all but a few trusted eyes. From the eastern slope, a small detachment of freedmen broke away under Gannicus's command, moving swiftly around the edge of the valley. They slipped through the narrow deer paths known only to the locals, their movement a silent ripple in the fabric of the land. Their target was not the front of the Roman force, but its heart. As Gannicus led his men into the shadowed woodland beyond, Spartacus watched the movement unfold with calm certainty. He knew the heart of the Roman command, a nexus of control and discipline, was the true keystone of the legion's strength. Strike there, and the iron wall would falter not from the blade, but from within. The minutes stretched into a quiet tension. The Romans pressed forward in grinding increments, their shields rising and falling in the slow, rhythmic dance of ordered combat. Then, from deep within their ranks, a sudden, muffled cry, followed by another, the sound of steel clashing in an unexpected place. Confusion stirred a ripple that passed through the Roman cohorts like a faint shiver down a living spine. Gannicus had reached the command center. Spartacus's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the subtle shift ripple through the legion's formation. It was not panic, not yet, but it was the beginning of something the legions feared more than death: disorder. Within moments, centurions barked sharp orders, trying to maintain the iron grip of command. The Roman lines tightened reflexively, shields pressing closer, ranks drawing inward like a creature curling upon itself, and in doing so, they weakened. The freedmen on the flanks struck again, this time not in fleeting raids, but with coordinated precision. Small groups pressed into the edges of the Roman lines, striking where the shields no longer overlapped, where the ranks grew too tight to maneuver. The legions fought back, But their blows landed with less certainty, their movements burdened by the press of their own numbers. Spartacus gave a slow, silent nod. The storm had begun to turn. Yet even in this moment, he felt no surge of triumph. Victory was not the aim of this quiet war. It was the shaping of a truth deeper than the outcome of a single battle, that Rome could be resisted, that the heart of a free man could stand, even against the shadow of an empire. As the sun dipped low upon the horizon, its light casting long shadows across a valley marked by the soft scars of struggle, Spartacus turned his gaze once more upon the field. The legions of Crassus fought on, disciplined, relentless. But in their eyes, the first flickers of doubt began to stir. And Spartacus knew, doubt was a wound no sword could mend. In the hush of twilight, upon a field not yet claimed, the quiet heart of rebellion beat on. Soft as the falling night, strong as the rising wind, the summer sun cast its warm gaze upon the land of southern Italy, gilding the soft hills and dusty roads with a light that seemed both eternal and indifferent. The rebellion of Spartacus, now entering its most perilous phase, was no longer a desperate flight of fugitives seeking freedom. It had become something else, a living, breathing force that gnawed at the heart of Roman power. By the time the harvest moon rose upon the vineyards of Campania, the insurgent army had grown beyond any earlier imagining. For many of those who followed Spartacus, the journey had been one of necessity, a grim march away from chains, hunger, and the cruelty of masters. But now, under the shadow of Spartacus's unwavering presence, a different hunger stirred among them. It was not just the yearning for liberty, but a thirst for meaning, for something larger than their fractured pasts. They were no longer mere fugitives. They had become a people, united by the silent oath of defiance and the thin hope that perhaps, somehow, they could forge a future unbound by Roman chains. By the autumn of that year, Spartacus had led his growing host southward again, towards the fertile plains of Lucania. The land here bore the scent of olives and wild thyme, and its hills rolled gently towards the distant sea. Villages fell silent at the mere rumour of the rebels' approach, and the Roman garrisons left to guard the countryside had long since melted away before them. Yet Spartacus's heart, often as still as the dark waters of the Sarnus River, remained unsettled. The memories of the Senate's last response gnawed at his mind. He had seen it, the cold calculation of Crassus, the rich man's cruelty wielded not with reckless passion, but with the deliberate precision of a butcher sharpening his blade. Unlike the blundering commanders Rome had sent before, Marcus Licinius Crassus was no fool. His eyes, set like dark stones beneath a furrowed brow, missed little. The walls that Crassus built were not merely of stone and timber, they were walls of fear, discipline, and ruthless ambition. Crassus had marched south with 6 legions, a force drilled to the edge of madness, its ranks swelled with the promise of riches and the shadow of death for those who faltered. His soldiers obeyed not only out of loyalty but out of dread, for Crassus revived the ancient and savage punishment of decimation. When a cohort faltered, every 10th man was executed by his own comrades. The message was clear. Cowardice would cost more than life. It would stain the soul. And so, as Spartacus' army gathered near the town of Petelia, the whispers of Crassus' advance began to swirl like the autumn winds. Scouts returned with tales of fortified camps cutting across the land, of trenches so deep they swallowed horses whole, of walls stretched like snares around the hills and plains. The path northward, towards the Alps, towards the fragile hope of escape, was closing like a Roman fist. Yet Spartacus did not falter. He stood at the crest of a low hill on a dusky evening, watching the golden haze settle over the land. His mind wandered, not to war or tactics, but to a memory faint and half forgotten. He recalled a time in his youth when he had stood beside his father on a ridge in Thrace, watching the sun die over the forests. His father had spoken then, in the soft tones of a man who had known both love and sorrow. Freedom, his father had said, is not the absence of chains. It is the courage to bear the weight of your own will. The words had meant little to a boy yet unshackled by fate. But now, with the weight of thousands of lives pressing upon his shoulders, Spartacus understood. He did not fight because he believed they would win. He fought because to kneel would be to forget the taste of the wind, the smell of rain upon the hills, the sound of his name spoken without scorn. The council of leaders, Gannicus, Crixus, Castus, and others gathered that night around a modest fire. The flicker of flames danced upon their weary faces, each marked by lines of battle and the quiet scars of leadership. Gannicus spoke first, his voice low and edged with the mirthless humour of a man who had seen too many friends die. "We have gold, food, weapons, and yet we are cornered like wolves in a narrowing gorge. Crassus will come, and he will come with blood in his hands." Crixus, fierce and impetuous as ever, clenched his fists around the hilt of his sword. "Then let him come. We shall meet him with open arms and a blade to his heart." But it was Castus, quieter and more reflective, who spoke with the weight of bitter reason. "And if we fall, what will become of our people? The children, the women, those who cannot lift a sword?" The silence that followed hung heavy. Spartacus gazed into the heart of the fire, watching embers drift skyward like tiny, fleeting souls. "We have one chance," Spartacus said at last, his voice soft but firm. "We break through his lines. We do not stand and wait for death. We strike where he does not expect, with speed that belies our wariness." Gannicus tilted his head, curiosity mingling with a shadow of doubt. "And if we fail?" Spartacus met his gaze, eyes steady as the earth beneath them. "Then we shall fall as free men, not as hunted beasts." The decision was made, not with shouts or fervent declarations, but with the silent nods of men who knew the weight of choosing between doom and despair. The plan was daring to the point of madness, a sudden strike against a weaker point in Crassus's fortifications, a night assault when vigilance waned. If they could break the chain, even for a moment, they might scatter into the hills, perhaps reach Brundisium or take ships southward. The days that followed passed like the soft breath of an hourglass, each grain of sand another moment closer to fate. The army moved quietly, beneath veils of night and the soft hush of fog. Spartacus walked among them, not as a distant leader upon a horse, but as a comrade. He spoke with the old, the young, the scarred veterans, and the trembling new recruits. He shared bread, clasped hands, and whispered words of hope that clung to the heart like a fragile ember against the cold. On the eve of their assault, Spartacus stood once more before his gathered host. Torches flickered in the night air, their flames trembling like the hearts of those who held them. He did not speak of glory nor of vengeance. His words were simple, slow, and steady. "Tomorrow we face a wall of steel and stone. We face men who would see us chained, broken, or dead. But remember, before they called us slaves, we were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. We were people. And tomorrow we will show them that no chain, no sword, no wall can bind the spirit of those who remember who they are." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not a roar of war cries, but a solemn, rising hum of resolve. And in that fragile moment, beneath the endless Roman sky, they stood as one. The night deepened, soft and silent as the hush before a storm. And the rebellion, like a sleeping lion poised to wake, waited upon the edge of destiny. The night unfolded with a hush that settled over the plains like a velvet shroud. The winds, which so often whispered through the olive groves and the cypress stands, seemed now to hold their breath. Beneath the endless sweep of the stars, Spartacus's army gathered, a silent host wrapped in the shadows of their fate. They moved with the quiet precision of those who knew that every sound could betray them, every misstep could doom them all. Spartacus walked among his soldiers, his footsteps as soft as the touch of dew upon the earth. No gleam of polished steel flashed beneath the moonlight. Every blade was darkened with soot and oil, every shield wrapped in cloth to mute its voice against the night. They had stripped themselves of adornments, casting aside the trappings of captured wealth, the golden torques and silver bracelets taken in their long campaign. Tonight they would carry nothing but the weight of necessity and the hope of freedom. The target of their desperate assault lay ahead, a segment of Crassus's fortifications, hastily constructed along a rugged ridge where the Roman lines stretched thinner than elsewhere. The wall there was made of timber palisades, earthworks hastily raised and guarded by a detachment of soldiers believed to be weary from long watches and the creeping arrogance that came with underestimation. Spartacus had chosen this point not out of recklessness, but from the quiet study of the land and the whispered reports of his scouts. As the last hours before midnight slipped away, a low mist began to crawl along the ground. It coiled around the soldiers' feet, veiling their movements in a cloak of white. It was a gift Spartacus had neither prayed for nor expected, a silent ally from the unseen hand of nature. Among the ranks, a soft ripple of guarded hope stirred. They moved now in smaller groups, assigned their tasks with quiet gestures rather than words. Gannicus led a band of swift-footed Gauls, their mission to strike first and create a breach wide enough for the others to pour through. Beside him walked Castus, whose silent nod to Spartacus spoke volumes of trust and shared resolve. Crixus, as always, stood where the fight would be fiercest, his broad shoulders squared beneath the weight of expectation and destiny alike. Spartacus himself would move with the second wave, a choice that stirred murmurs among his closest captains. A leader of his stature, they believed, should not risk himself at the heart of the assault, but Spartacus had merely smiled, his answer spoken with a calm certainty that had earned him the loyalty of thousands. "I lead," he had said, "not from the rear, but from where the danger lies deepest." The signal was simple, a single raven's cry, rendered by hand through a hollowed reed. At its sound they would move. Spartacus gripped the hilt of his sword, its worn leather familiar beneath his hand, and gazed once more into the shadowed hills where the Roman walls loomed. The fate of every soul under his charge hung upon the next few moments, each heartbeat a silent drumbeat to the unknown. The cry came, low and sharp against the night's hush. Gannicus moved first, his band slipping forward like shadows made flesh. They closed upon the Roman palisade with silent determination, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth and the mist that swirled like breath at their knees. At the walls, Roman sentries, lulled by long hours of uneventful watch, stood in idle clusters, their torches flickering dim against the mist. Gannicus did not charge. He and his men flowed like a wave, swift and merciless, their first blows falling before a single shout could rise. The startled cries of the guards were smothered beneath the quiet, brutal work of blades and choking hands. Spartacus watched from a slight rise as the first gap in the Roman defence yawned open like a wound upon the night. Then, with a single gesture, he led the second wave forward. They came, hundreds strong, their feet silent, their hearts a storm beneath the calm of their faces. Spartacus ran at the head, the wind cool against his brow, his sword held low but ready. The earth trembled faintly beneath the press of so many determined souls moving as one. By the time the Romans within the camp stirred fully to the alarm, the rebels were upon them. The night exploded, not with the roar of battle, but with the swift, bitter sound of steel upon flesh, the thud of bodies falling, the muffled grunts of men fighting not for glory, but for life itself. Spartacus moved like a shadow through the chaos, his blade finding its mark with deadly precision. Around him, the rebellion surged forward, a tide of desperate hope and hardened will. Roman soldiers, once the feared arbiters of the world's greatest empire, faltered beneath the unexpected onslaught. Their lines buckled, their discipline shattered by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack. A cohort broke ranks and fled towards the heart of the camp, their cries tearing through the night air. But the Romans were not without their hardened men, veterans who rallied quickly beneath centurions barking orders. Formations closed, shields locked, and the counterattack surged with the brutal efficiency that had conquered nations. Spartacus met them head-on. His sword clashed against a Roman scutum, the jarring impact singing along his arm. He slipped past the guard of a legionary, his blade cutting a swift arc that sent the soldier crumpling to the earth. Another lunged, and Spartacus turned the blow aside, striking low with a ruthless thrust. Around him, the rebels pressed the advantage, fighting not with the practiced drills of soldiers, but with the raw, desperate ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. For a brief, shattering moment, it seemed as though the line might break, the Roman formation folding like a cracked shell before the hammer of the insurgent assault. But Crassus had planned well. A clarion call rose beyond the ridge, sharp and commanding. From the darkness came the surge of fresh Roman reinforcements, their armor gleaming faintly beneath the moon. They poured into the fray with grim determination, closing the breach, forcing the rebels back step by step. Spartacus fought like a man possessed, his every movement a dance between life and death. But even he could see the tide turning. The element of surprise had bought them precious moments. moments that now bled away beneath the weight of Roman numbers and discipline. He shouted for the withdrawal, his voice cutting through the din like a clear bell. Gannicus, his sword red and his face set in grim lines, echoed the call. The rebels began to fall back, not in rout, but in the controlled retreat of those who knew their lives depended on every measured step. Spartacus remained at the rear, covering the withdrawal with a handful of his finest warriors. The Romans pressed hard, their spears lunging, their shields ramming forward with brutal force. Spartacus felt the sting of a blade graze his arm, the heat of blood warm against the night's chill. They fell back towards the hills, slipping into the mist that wrapped them once more in its ghostly arms. The Romans did not pursue far, content to hold their lines, to watch as the rebels vanished into the folds of the land. By the time dawn's pale light crept across the horizon, the battlefield lay silent once more. The breach had failed to open wide enough for escape. The path north remained barred by walls of Roman steel and the iron will of Crassus, but they had not been broken. Spartacus stood upon a high ridge as the sun rose, his gaze cast far over the plains where the Roman camps stretched like dark scars upon the earth. The assault had failed, but they had struck a blow that would echo through the ranks of both their enemies and their own. They had shown that even at the edge of doom, they would not surrender to fate without a fight. And in the quiet hush of the morning, Spartacus felt a calm resolve settle within him. The road ahead was shrouded in shadow, but as long as they could walk it together, as long as hope yet flickered within the hearts of those who followed him, they would not bow. The rebellion still breathed. The sun climbed slowly over the hills of Lucania, casting its gentle warmth upon a land marked by the scars of war. The countryside awoke in soft murmurs, the rustle of olive branches, the low hum of bees in the flowering meadows, but beneath this tranquil facade, a storm brewed within the hearts of the men and women who followed Spartacus. The failed assault upon Crassus's lines had left them weary, not only in body but in spirit. And yet, no voices cried for surrender. No hands trembled in the face of despair. There remained within the rebel camp a silent, stubborn ember that refused to die. Spartacus moved among them at dawn, his steps unhurried, his gaze steady. The wound upon his arm, a shallow cut from the night's fierce fighting, had been bound in linen strips, the cloth stained with the pale crimson of his blood. Yet he bore it lightly, as though it were no more than a fleeting discomfort. The men and women he passed greeted him with nods, some with faint, weary smiles. Their eyes held the quiet fire of those who had stared into the jaws of death and stepped back into the light. The camp had settled upon a high ridge, where the dense woods offered concealment and the slopes gave protection from mounted assault. They built no fires, lest the smoke betray their presence, and they spoke in hushed tones. Scouts had returned with grim news. Crassus tightened his encirclement, reinforcing every breach, extending his fortifications like an iron serpent across the hills and valleys. The trap was closing. Yet within this tightening ring, Spartacus wove a different thread. He gathered his captains beneath the shelter of a rocky overhang, the moss-covered stones muffling their voices. Gannicus sat with his back against the stone, arms crossed, his face marked with both fatigue and quiet defiance. Crixus crouched beside him, his hands clasped loosely around his knees, a restless energy humming beneath his stillness. Castus leaned upon his spear, silent as always, while Nasir, young yet fierce, stood nearby with a gaze sharp as the winter wind. Spartacus spoke, his voice low but certain. "We are not yet broken. Crassus believes he holds us in a cage, but a cage can be broken if struck in the right place." Gannicus gave a soft snort, though his eyes sparkled with a hint of wry amusement. "You speak as if we have the hammer, my friend. I see only chains tightening with each day." Spartacus met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Then we must become the hammer, not through force alone, but with the sharpness of the mind." A soft murmur passed between them. Crixus leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Speak plain. What would you have us do?" Spartacus turned his eyes to the valley beyond, where the distant shimmer of Roman shields caught the morning light. "Crassus expects us to flee north. He watches for that. But what if we strike south instead, to Brundisium? The port remains within reach, and beyond it, the seas." Castus frowned, his voice a quiet whisper. "We have no ships. Not yet. Spartacus replied. "But the city holds merchants, sailors, men of trade. With coin, with promises of freedom, perhaps even with force, we may yet find passage." The idea hung in the air, bold and fraught with peril. Brundisium was a Roman stronghold, yet its heart pulsed with the blood of commerce, a place where loyalty bent often to the weight of gold. Gannicus let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "A madman's hope, which means it may just be our best chance." Crixus cracked a slow smile, the fierce light of challenge returning to his eyes. "And if Crassus gives chase—" Spartacus's gaze darkened with resolve. "Then we bleed him for every step he takes. We harry his supply lines, we strike his camps by night. We become the shadow he cannot shake." A quiet stillness followed. One by one, his captains nodded, not in blind agreement, but in the shared understanding of men who had walked the thin edge of survival together. They knew the dangers. They tasted the risk upon their tongues. But they also felt the weight of possibility, the sliver of hope that, like a blade's edge, could cut a path through the tightening noose. As the council dispersed, Spartacus remained, his eyes following the slow drift of clouds across the sky. The air carried the scent of pine and distant sea spray, a reminder that the world beyond this cage of Roman steel still lay waiting, untouched by the shadow of empire. He breathed in deeply, letting the quiet calm of the land seep into his bones. He thought then of Verenia. Her face came to him, soft in the folds of memory. The curve of her smile, the laughter that once danced upon her lips, the strength in her eyes that had mirrored his own resolve. She had been taken from him, long before this rebellion had gathered its storm. Yet her spirit lingered, a silent companion beside him on every road, in every battle. He wondered, not for the first time, if she would have understood this path he had chosen. He believed she would. The preparations began that very night. They moved in small bands, slipping from the main encampment beneath the cover of darkness. Gannicus led raiding parties against Roman supply trains, striking with the speed of wolves and vanishing before the legions could muster a response. Castus scouted the southern roads, marking paths through the lesser-known passes where the hills crumbled into wooded valleys. Crixus drilled the fighters who remained, forging their desperation into a sharp, cohesive force. Spartacus moved among them all, offering not commands from a distance, but his presence. A hand upon a shoulder, a word of encouragement, a glance that spoke of shared burdens and shared hopes. The bonds between them, forged in blood and suffering, hardened into something unbreakable. The days slipped by like whispered prayers, each one carrying them closer to the moment of reckoning. The Romans pressed their advantage, yet found themselves bleeding from 1,000 unseen wounds. Their supply lines grew perilous, their sentries unnerved by shadows in the night. Crassus, though a master of discipline, could not seal every crack, could not snuff out every ember. One evening, as a pale crescent moon hung low over the hills, Spartacus stood upon a rocky outcrop with Gannicus by his side. The fires of the Roman camps flickered distantly, a necklace of light upon the darkened land. "She was right, you know," Gannicus said softly. Spartacus glanced at him, a faint question in his eyes. "You're Verenia. To love a man like you, she must have known this was always your fate, to stand against the world itself." Spartacus gave a quiet smile, the edges tinged with a sadness as deep as the sea. "It is not the world I stand against, only those who would bind it in chains." Gannicus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "A fine difference, my friend, but perhaps a difference worth dying for." The two men stood in silence, the cool wind stirring their cloaks, carrying with it the distant sound of a Roman horn. And beneath the endless sky the rebellion waited, not in fear nor in resignation, but in the quiet strength of those who know their hour has come. The dawn of their final march broke with a sky veiled in soft grey, a hush upon the land that seemed to echo the solemn hearts of those preparing for what might be their last endeavour. The army of Spartacus gathered in the half-light, not in wild cries or defiant boasts, but in a quiet, ordered resolve, born of long struggle and a deep, wordless bond that had been forged in the crucible of their rebellion. They stood upon the southern slopes of the Lucanian hills, where the woods gave way to open land that rolled gently toward the distant sea. The path before them wound through narrow passes, shadowed by cliffs and dense thickets, a route carefully chosen for its obscurity and the promise of a swift, unseen passage southward. It was a road few Roman patrols would expect them to take, for it led not toward escape by land, but toward the uncertain hope of the sea at Brundisium. Spartacus moved among his people in those quiet hours before the march. He passed by groups of warriors sharpening their blades in silence, women packing what little they could carry upon rough-worn carts, children huddled close beside their mothers. There were no banners raised, no horns sounded. Even the youngest among them seemed to understand the gravity of this hour. The rebellion had become more than a cause. It was a living spirit that walked among them, a spirit born of shared hardship, sharpened by countless battles and nourished by the simple, stubborn desire to live free. He paused beside a group of Thracian fighters, men from his homeland, whose eyes reflected the deep earth of the forests he had once called home. They clasped his arms in the firm grip of brothers, saying little, their respect given not in words but in the quiet, steady nods of men who would follow him to the end. Farther along, Gannicus oversaw the final preparations of the vanguard, a mixed band of Gauls, Germans and Greeks who had fought beside him in the harshest moments of the campaign. His face was set in a half-smile, but his eyes burned with a fierce clarity. As Spartacus approached, he gave a brief bow, one warrior to another. "South it is, then," Gannicus said quietly. A bold stroke. Spartacus met his gaze. "It is the only stroke left to us." Crixus arrived shortly after, a grim shadow following close behind him. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, his eyes dark beneath furrowed brows. He carried no shield, only a heavy sword slung across his back, a symbol perhaps of the battle he knew would come before they reached the sea. "They will not give chase lightly," Crixus said. "Crassus will not leave his lines unguarded for fear of seeming weak before Rome. But once he learns of our movement, he will come." Spartacus gave a slow nod. "Then we must move faster than his pride." A faint, sardonic chuckle escaped Gannicus' lips. "Let us hope his pride is as fat as his purse." The plan was set into motion with the softest of commands, carried down the lines in whispered words and silent gestures. The first ranks moved with the care of hunters in a hostile land, feet muffled by cloth bindings, shields slung upon their backs, weapons drawn only when the shadows grew thick. They slipped from the ridge into the mists of the lower valleys, the great host flowing like a silent river through the landscape that had become both prison and battlefield. Spartacus led from the forefront, as he always had, not from a place of distant command, but at the very heart of the risk, where his presence gave courage and steadiness to those around him. Each step forward was a quiet defiance of the chains they had once borne. Each mile southward, a refusal to yield to the fate the world had written for them. For 3 days and nights they moved without incident, slipping past Roman patrols that never knew they passed so close. The rebels hunted only when necessity demanded, living upon meagre stores, drinking from streams that wound like silver veins through the woods. Sleep came in brief snatches, beneath boughs thick with the hush of the forest, while sentinels stood watch with eyes sharpened by the long shadow of war. On the 4th day, the road began to widen, opening onto a narrow pass between 2 steep ridges. The air here was tinged with the faint salt scent of the sea, a silent whisper of their goal drawing near. Spirits lifted, not with reckless hope, but with a cautious, hard-earned sense that the impossible might yet be within reach. But fate, ever the silent watcher of men's struggles, had not yet played her final hand. As they descended toward the lowlands near Grumentum, the first signs of Roman pursuit reached them. A plume of dust upon the northern horizon, the distant glint of sunlight upon armor. Scouts returned with grim reports. A Roman detachment, fast-moving, expertly led. Crassus himself had taken the bait sooner than expected. The news rippled through the rebel host like a chill wind. There were no cries of fear, no whispered panic. They had known this might come. Spartacus gathered his captains upon a rocky ledge overlooking a narrow gorge through which their path must pass. The sound of the sea was faint upon the wind, a siren's song calling them forward. "We stand upon the edge of our hope," Spartacus said softly, his voice low but steady. "The sea lies before us, but Crassus follows with all the force of Rome at his back. We cannot outrun him on open ground." Crixus drew his sword with a soft metallic hiss. Then we stand here, we bleed him, we buy time. Gannicus gave a slow, wolfish grin. A rearguard action. I would expect nothing less. Spartacus looked over each of them, his eyes lingering not upon their faces, but upon the weight they each carried, the burden of countless souls who marched in their shadow. This is no death march. You know the cost. But if we stand here, if we hold them, even for a day, it may be enough. No words were needed beyond that. The understanding passed between them in a glance, in the clasp of hands roughened by sword and shield, in the silent bond that had woven them together beyond the reach of fear. By dusk, the rear guard stood in formation upon the heights above the narrow gorge, a line not of soldiers, but of brothers and sisters in arms. They took their places not as an army, but as a family bound by choice and by the unyielding strength of those who refused to bow. Spartacus stood at their centre, his sword drawn, the weight of his resolve as tangible as the steel in his hand. The Roman vanguard appeared at the head of the pass as the sun sank into the western sea, their formation precise, their standards gleaming in the fading light. They advanced with the steady, relentless march of those who believed themselves the masters of the world. And at the narrowest point of the gorge, beneath the watchful eyes of gods and men, the rebellion made its final stand. There were no grand speeches, no cries to the heavens, only the soft clatter of steel, the quiet murmur of whispered farewells, and the steady, unbroken line of those who had come to the edge of the world and chosen to face the storm together. The clash came with the fury of a summer tempest, a roar of steel and blood upon the stones of the narrow pass. And in that place, where hope met defiance and the world held its breath, the spirit of Spartacus burned brighter than ever before, an ember against the dark, a whisper of freedom upon the wind.